They erased me from the wedding video like I never existed. Every childhood photo cropped. Every family moment edited out. My mother handed me the invitation with dead eyes and said, "The best gift you could give Claire is to disappear from this family." So I did. But here's what they didn't know: the house they were celebrating and the bank accounts paying for that perfect wedding. The life they thought was theirs. My father made sure I controlled it all. He saw them coming years before I did. 1 week before my sister walked down the aisle, I activated a legal clause they didn't know existed. Within 72 hours, their dream wedding collapsed. The venue locked its doors. The caterer canceled. Every deposit frozen. And when they came home that night, the house they'd taken for granted stood empty, gutted, silent. But I didn't just take their things. I left something behind. Something that would force them to face the truth they'd buried for decades. A truth about who I really was in this family and what they'd actually lost. What I discovered inside that house, hidden in a frame, locked in a vault, recorded on a USB drive, didn't just destroy a wedding. It unraveled a conspiracy, exposed the man my sister was about to marry, and revealed that my disappearance wasn't the end of their nightmare. It was the beginning of mine becoming their judge, their jury, and the ghost they could never escape. Stay with me, because what happens next will make you believe in karma and the power of a woman who finally stops being silent. My name is Victoria Whitmore. I'm 42 years old, a senior compliance officer at a mid-sized financial firm in Portland, Oregon. For the past 20 years, I've built a career on spotting inconsistencies, the numbers that don't add up, the signatures that look just slightly off, the patterns that reveal when someone's hiding something. I'm good at my job because I pay attention to details other people miss. What I never expected was that I'd need those same skills to see the truth about my own family. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late September. I found it wedged in my mailbox between a utility bill and a grocery store flyer, the thick, cream-colored envelope immediately standing out. My younger sister Claire was getting married. I'd known it was coming. She'd announced her engagement 6 months earlier in a family group text that felt more like a press release than a personal message. But holding the physical invitation made it real in a way the digital announcement hadn't. I carried it upstairs to my apartment, setting my work bag down by the door and slipping off my heels before settling onto the couch. The envelope was formal, expensive. Embossed lettering spelled out my name and address with the kind of precision you pay extra for. I ran my thumb under the seal and pulled out the card. Heavy cardstock. Elegant script. Claire Margaret Whitmore and Mark Christopher Chen request the honor of your presence. The date was 3 weeks away. A Saturday in October at some vineyard outside the city I'd never heard of. But there was no handwritten note. No, "Can't wait to celebrate with you, sis," scrawled across the back. No personal touch at all. Just the formal printed invitation and a small card with a QR code printed on it. "Scan to view our family memory reel." It read in delicate italics. I should have known better. I should have left it alone. But I pulled out my phone and pointed the camera at the code. The screen loaded for a moment, then a video player appeared. 8 minutes and 43 seconds long. The title appeared in flowing script, Claire's Journey to Forever. I pressed play. The video opened with baby photos: Claire in a hospital blanket, Claire taking her first steps, Claire blowing out birthday candles. There I was in some of those early shots, a gangly teenager holding my baby sister, smiling at the camera. Our father stood behind me in one photo, his hand on my shoulder. I remembered that day. I remembered how proud I'd felt to be a big sister. But as the video progressed through the years, something changed. The photos from Claire's elementary school years still showed me there I was at her school, play at her soccer games, at family dinners. Our father was in those photos too, before the Alzheimer's took him from us. Then came the teenage years, the high school graduations, the college acceptance celebrations. And suddenly I wasn't there anymore. Except I had been there. I knew I had been. I remembered taking Claire to her college orientation because our mother was too depressed to function. I remembered helping her move into her first apartment. Remembered co-signing her car lease when she was 23 and had no credit history. But in this video, those moments existed without me. Photos were cropped at awkward angles. Group shots were digitally edited, leaving strange empty spaces where I should have been standing. In some images, you could still see part of my arm or shoulder at the edge of the frame, a ghost limb that hadn't been fully erased. The past decade of Claire's life unfolded on my phone screen as if I'd never been part of it. Her career milestones, her travel photos, the day she met Mark, their engagement party last spring. I'd attended that party. I'd brought a gift. I'd given a toast that no one had really listened to, but in the video I might as well have never existed. I watched the entire 8 minutes, then I watched it again. And a third time. Each replay deepened the hollow ache spreading through my chest, that feeling of becoming transparent, of being slowly erased from the narrative of my own family. By the third viewing, the ache had crystallized into something harder, something clear and cold, like ice. I set my phone down and stared at the wall of my apartment. Framed diplomas from college and graduate school hung there. Photos of colleagues from work conferences. A watercolor painting I'd bought at a street fair. The accumulation of a life built carefully independently without asking anyone for help. I'd taught myself to need no one after our father died. After I watched my mother crumble and my sister spiral, after I held everything together until there was nothing left of me to hold. I'd learned to be self-sufficient. I'd thought that was strength. But looking at that wall, I realized how alone I actually was. No partner, no children. Just work and an apartment that looked more like a hotel room than a home. And a family that had decided I was so dispensable they could literally edit me out of history. I picked up my phone again and checked the RSVP card. It had my name printed on it with a checkbox for accepts with pleasure and another for declines with regret. There was no +1 option. Of course there wasn't. The reception details were on a separate card. Black tie optional. Adults only. Registry information available online. I should have declined. I should have checked that box, dropped the card in the mail, and moved on with my life. Let them have their perfect wedding without the inconvenient older sister who apparently didn't fit the aesthetic they were going for. But I didn't. Instead, I got in my car and drove to my mother's house. The house where I grew up. The house where I'd spent my teenage years raising my sister, while my mother drifted through her depression like a ghost. The house I'd cleaned and maintained and paid utilities for when neither of them could manage it. The house that should have felt like home, but had always felt more like a debt I couldn't finish paying. When I pulled up, the driveway was full of cars. I recognized my aunt's SUV, my mother's best friend's sedan, some vehicles I didn't know. The front door was propped open with a box, and I could hear voices and laughter spilling out into the October afternoon. I walked inside without knocking. No one noticed me at first. The living room had been transformed into wedding planning central. Fabric swatches covered the coffee table. Seating charts were spread across the dining table. My mother stood over them with a pen making notes while Claire's friends clustered around her offering opinions. Claire herself held court on the sofa, her left hand extended so someone could admire her engagement ring. She looked radiant in the way 28-year-old women do when they're about to marry someone wealthy, and the world feels like it's unfolding exactly according to plan. I stood in the doorway between the hall and the living room waiting. It took almost a full minute before my mother glanced up. "Victoria," she said flatly. Not a greeting. Just an acknowledgement of my presence the way you might note that it had started raining. "I got the invitation," I said. "Good." My mother looked back down at her seating charts. "You're at table 9. Table 9. I didn't need to ask where that was. I knew it would be the table farthest from the head table tucked in some corner near the kitchen doors, filled with distant cousins, and my mother's co-workers who didn't know anyone else. "I watched the video," I continued. My mother's pen paused for the briefest moment, then continued moving across the page. "Claire worked very hard on that." Across the room, Claire looked up. Our eyes met. She was smiling, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who knew exactly what they'd done and was daring me to make a scene about it. "The best gift you could give me," Claire said, her voice light and casual like she was commenting on the weather, "is to disappear." The words hung in the air. No one else seemed to register them as particularly cruel. A few of her friends giggled. My mother returned to her seating chart as if Claire had just asked me to pick up ice on the way to the reception. I stood there in the kitchen where I'd cooked countless meals for this family, where I'd made dinner night after night during the year our father was dying because no one else had the energy or the will, where I'd taught Claire how to make scrambled eggs and tie her shoes and do long division. Now I was being treated like an intruder in a space I'd held together with my own exhausted hands. I didn't argue, I didn't shout or demand an apology or ask why they'd erased me from a decade of family history. I'd learned years ago that arguing with my mother was like arguing with fog. There was nothing solid to push against, just a damp indifference that seeped into everything. Instead, I walked slowly to the mantel above the fireplace, where a photo of our father sat in a simple wooden frame. He'd died 5 years ago, his mind already mostly gone by the end. But I remembered the man he'd been before the disease took him. The man who'd told me in one of his last lucid moments that the house was my safety net. I'd never fully understood what he meant. I reached out and straightened the frame. It had been sitting at a slight angle and the perfectionist in me couldn't leave it that way. As I adjusted it, I felt something shift inside the backing. A tiny click so subtle I almost missed it. Something mechanical. Something deliberate. I glanced around. No one was watching me. They'd already dismissed my presence entirely. I let my hand drop and stepped back from the mantel. My mind was already working, cataloging that small anomaly. That click. That hidden something my father might have left behind. A message, maybe. Or a key. Or just a coincidence, a loose backing in an old frame. But I didn't think it was a coincidence. My father had been meticulous even as his mind deteriorated. If there was something in that frame, he'd put it there intentionally. And if he'd put it there, maybe he'd left other things too. Other protections. Other truths that my mother and sister didn't know about. I walked back through the chaos of wedding planning, past the laughter and the fabric swatches and the centerpiece debates. No one said goodbye. No one even looked up. I got in my car and sat there for a long moment, hands on the steering wheel, staring at the house where I'd grown up. The house that had never really felt like mine, even though I'd been the one to hold it together. Then I whispered to myself, barely audible even in the silence of my car, "If they want me gone, they'll get exactly that." I started the engine and drove away. But I wasn't running. I was calculating. Because if there's one thing my job has taught me, it's that everyone leaves a trail. Everyone makes mistakes. And every system has vulnerabilities if you know where to look. It was time to start looking. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind circling back through decades of memories I'd spent years trying to forget. The click in the picture frame, my father's face in that photograph, the way Claire had smiled when she told me to disappear. It all pulled at something buried deep, something I'd worked hard to keep locked away, because examining it too closely had always felt like staring into a wound that would never heal. But now the wound was open anyway, so I let myself remember. I was 16 when everything fell apart the first time. My father had just been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's, though we didn't use that word yet. We called it forgetfulness and confusion and stress from work. My mother, who'd always been fragile in ways I didn't understand as a child, simply stopped functioning. She'd sit at the kitchen table for hours, staring at nothing while bills piled up unopened, and Claire, only 8 years old, asked when someone would make dinner. So I made dinner, and I opened the bills, and I called the insurance company to figure out why they weren't covering my father's neurologist appointments. I was a junior in high school studying for the SATs, trying to maintain my grades so I could get into a good college and maybe someday have a life that belonged to me. Instead, I came home every day to chaos that only I seemed capable of managing. I walked Claire to school each morning because my mother couldn't get out of bed. I helped her with homework each night because no one else would. I learned to forge my mother's signature on permission slips and report cards because asking her to sign them meant waiting days for her to surface from whatever dark place she'd retreated into. When my father started forgetting to take his medications, I set up a pill organizer and reminded him every morning and evening. When he got lost driving home from the grocery store one Saturday afternoon, I was the one who drove around the neighborhood for 2 hours until I found him sitting in his car in a parking lot 3 miles away, confused and frightened. No one ever said thank you. There was never an acknowledgement that I'd given up my teenage years to hold the family together. It was simply assumed that this was my role now, the responsible one, the capable one, the one who didn't need help because she was too busy providing it to everyone else. My mother stopped seeing me as her daughter and started treating me like a co-parent, except without any of the authority or appreciation. Claire learned early that Victoria would always handle things, would always be there to solve problems, would always put her needs last. This became our family's operating system, the fundamental code that everything else ran on. I existed to serve. They existed to need. And questioning that arrangement would crash the entire system. I got into college on a full scholarship because my grades were perfect, and my essay about overcoming family adversity apparently moved the admissions committee. I commuted from home because I couldn't afford to leave Claire and my father. During my sophomore year, my father was hospitalized for 3 weeks with pneumonia, and I was the one who sat with him every evening after classes, the one who met with doctors, the one who understood his insurance coverage well enough to argue when they tried to discharge him too early. My mother visited twice. Claire didn't visit at all. She was in middle school then, wrapped up in her own dramas, and no one expected her to carry any weight. Only me. Always me. My father died 2 weeks after I turned 37. The Alzheimer's had progressed slowly then, all at once. By the end, he didn't remember my name most days, but occasionally he'd have moments of clarity that broke my heart. 3 weeks before he passed during one of those lucid windows, he'd grabbed my hand with surprising strength and looked directly into my eyes. "Vicky," he said, using the nickname only he ever called me, "the house is your safety net. No matter what happens, remember that. It's yours. Your protection." I didn't understand what he meant. I thought maybe he was confused again, mixing up past and present. But his eyes were clear and urgent, and he made me promise I'd remember. At his funeral, I was numb. I stood beside the casket, greeting people I barely knew, accepting condolences that felt hollow, holding myself together because someone had to organize the reception and thank the pastor and make sure Claire didn't fall apart completely. After everyone left, my mother handed me a thick folder of documents. "Estate paperwork," she said. "The lawyer said you need to sign these." I was drowning in grief and exhaustion. I signed where she pointed, page after page after page. My eyes blurred. My hand moved mechanically. I trusted that she wouldn't ask me to sign anything that wasn't necessary, that wasn't routine. Later, much later, I wondered about that trust. Why had she needed my signature on so many documents? What exactly had I agreed to? But by then I was back at work, back to my carefully constructed life of independence, and digging into old paperwork felt like voluntarily drowning myself in the past. So I let it go. Except, certain things kept arriving in my name. Property tax notices, homeowners insurance renewals, once a letter from the county about updating property records. Each time I'd call my mother to ask about it and she'd say it was a clerical error, something that hadn't been updated yet, nothing to worry about. Eventually I stopped calling. I assumed the bureaucracy would sort itself out eventually. But my father's words stayed with me. "The house is your safety net." What had he known? What had he arranged? Now, lying in bed, unable to sleep, watching the hours tick past midnight, I realized I'd been too tired and too trained to stop serving to ever ask the right questions. I'd built a successful career identifying financial irregularities for corporations, but I'd never turned that analytical eye on my own family's finances. Why would I, I'd spent my whole life being told implicitly and explicitly that my job was to facilitate, not to question, to support, not to examine. My career success felt hollow most days. I'd worked my way up to senior compliance officer, earned respect in my field, made a salary that afforded me a nice apartment and financial security. But my family never asked about my work. They didn't come to the ceremony when I received an industry award 2 years ago. My mother had said she was too tired. Claire had said she had plans. They didn't acknowledge my promotions or celebrate my accomplishments. To them, I was still just the person who handled things in the background, who existed to make their lives easier. The wedding video was just the visual representation of what had always been true. I was the supporting character in their story, and supporting characters don't get their own narrative arc. We exist to facilitate the protagonist's journey, then disappear when we're no longer useful to the plot. But this time, something inside me refused to disappear quietly. Maybe it was the blatant cruelty of digitally erasing me. Maybe it was Claire's casual dismissiveness. Or maybe it was just that I'd finally reached the limit of how much invisibility one person could endure. I got out of bed and opened my laptop. It was 2 a.m, but sleep wasn't coming anyway. I logged into my email and started searching. Property documents, tax notices, insurance papers, anything related to the house. There it was. An email from 5 years ago sent 3 months after my father's funeral. A notification from the bank about updated account information and property records. I clicked it open and read through the dense legal language. Then I read it again. My name was listed as joint owner of the property. Not co-signer, not secondary contact. Joint owner with full rights and access. My hand started shaking as I clicked on the attached PDF. The property deed. Filed with the county, notarized and legal. Victoria Ann Whitmore. Joint owner. My father had kept his promise after all. I called Ruth Hale's office first thing Wednesday morning. Ruth had been my father's estate attorney, a sharp woman in her early 60s with steel-gray hair cut in a precise bob and eyes that missed nothing. I'd met her exactly once at the reading of the will 5 years ago, where she'd explained the basic terms in language my grief-fogged brain could barely process. I remembered her as professional, direct, and surprisingly kind. When my mother had snapped at her for using legal terminology, my mother found condescending. Her assistant put me through immediately when I gave my name. Victoria Whitmore, Ruth said, and I could hear recognition in her voice. I wondered when you'd call. That stopped me. You were expecting me. Your father told me you'd figure it out eventually. He said you were the smart one, the one who paid attention. I'm actually surprised it took this long. We scheduled a meeting for that afternoon. I left work early, telling my supervisor I had a family emergency, which wasn't exactly a lie. Ruth's office was in an older building downtown, the kind with marble floors and brass elevator doors that spoke of established respectability. She met me in a conference room lined with law books, a thick file already spread across the polished table. "Let's not waste time," she said as I sat down. "You found the property deed notification." "Last night. I'm listed as joint owner, but I don't remember signing anything that would make that happen." Ruth slid a document across the table. "You didn't. Your father added you to the deed in 2015, 3 years after his diagnosis. He had the legal capacity to do so at that time. We made sure of it. Multiple witnesses, cognitive assessments, the works. It's ironclad." She tapped another document. "But that's not the part you really need to see. This is." I picked up the paper. The header read, "Conditional Inheritance Protective Trust Clause," in formal legal script. The document was dated October 2018, notarized bearing my father's shaky signature alongside Ruth's witness signature and 2 others I didn't recognize. "Read the operative language," Ruth instructed, pointing to a highlighted section. I read slowly, my compliance training kicking in as I parsed the legal terminology. The clause specified that if Victoria Ann Whitmore was systematically excluded from significant family events, or if attempts were made to force her removal from family property or financial matters, full control of the residential property and associated estate accounts would transfer solely to her name. The transfer would activate upon filing of documented evidence with the trustee, subject to a mandatory 7-business-day review period. He wrote this when he still had good days, Ruth said quietly. Days when he could see clearly what was happening in your family. He told me, "My wife is weak, and weakness makes people cruel. My younger daughter is learning to be selfish because no one's teaching her otherwise. But Victoria will keep sacrificing herself until there's nothing left unless I stop it." Ruth's voice was matter-of-fact, but not unkind. "Your father loved your mother and Claire, but he saw the patterns. He watched you disappear a little more each year. This was his safety switch." My throat felt tight. "How does it work?" Ruth pulled out a legal pad and drew a simple timeline. "You provide documented evidence of exclusion. The wedding video qualifies. The invitation with no personal note qualifies. If you have witnesses who heard your sister tell you to disappear, even better. We file activation paperwork with the county today, right now, if you're ready. Within 5 to 7 business days, the accounts tied to the estate will freeze pending transfer of sole ownership to you. The house title transfers simultaneously. You're not stealing anything. You're enforcing the terms of a legal document your father created specifically to protect you. The wedding is in 3 weeks. Then we have time." Ruth leaned forward. "But Victoria, you need to understand what you're starting. Once we file this paperwork, there's no taking it back quietly. Your mother and sister will fight. They'll accuse you of terrible things. They'll twist the narrative to make you the villain. The court won't care about their feelings, the law is on your side, but your family relationships will implode. Are you ready for that?" I thought about the video where I'd been erased, about Claire's casual cruelty, about my mother's decades of indifference, about all the years I'd spent believing that if I just helped enough, sacrificed enough, was useful enough, they'd finally see me as someone who mattered. "I've been ready my whole life," I said, and my voice was steadier than I expected. "I just didn't know it until now." Ruth nodded once, crisp and businesslike. "Good. Then let's begin." She pulled out a form and started filling in information. "I'll need copies of the invitation, access to the video, and written statements about what your sister said. Can you provide those?" "Yes, all of it." "Perfect. I'll file this afternoon. The clock starts today." I left her office 90 minutes later with copies of everything, a timeline written in Ruth's precise handwriting, and a strange sense of calm I hadn't felt in weeks. This wasn't revenge. Revenge was emotional, messy, uncontrolled. This was enforcement. This was boundaries. This was finally protecting myself the way my father had tried to protect me when he'd known he wouldn't be around to do it in person. But there was one more thing I needed to understand. I needed to know exactly what accounts were tied to this estate, what Claire's perfect wedding was actually being funded with. I had a suspicion, but I needed confirmation. I called the wedding planner from my car using the number printed on the vendor information card that had come with the invitation. "Hi, this is Victoria Whitmore, Claire's sister. I'm helping coordinate some family logistics and wanted to touch base about the payment schedule." The planner, a cheerful woman named Melissa, was happy to help. "Oh, wonderful. It's so nice when families work together on these big events. What do you need to know?" "Just want to make sure everything's on track with the deposits. Which account are the payments coming from? I want to make sure there are no conflicts on our end." "Let me pull that up." I heard keyboard clicking. "Okay, here we are. The primary account ends in 4739. Your mother set that up as the main payment source. We've got the venue deposit, catering deposit, and floral deposit all charged to that account. The final payments are scheduled to process 1 week before the wedding. Account 4739. I'd seen that number on the estate documents Ruth had shown me. It was one of the accounts my father had set up years ago, one of the accounts that would freeze when the protective clause activated. "Perfect," I told Melissa, keeping my voice light and professional. That's exactly what I needed to know. Thank you so much for your help. Of course, we're so excited for Claire's big day. Only 3 weeks away. Yes, I said. 3 weeks. I ended the call and sat in my car in the parking garage watching the numbers on the dashboard clock change. The paperwork was filed. The countdown had started. In 5 to 7 business days, everything my sister thought she had would begin to crumble, and she wouldn't understand why until it was too late to stop it. My phone buzzed with a text from Ruth. Documents filed. Official notice will be served Monday. No turning back now. I didn't want to turn back. For the first time in my adult life, I was moving forward instead of just holding everything together for everyone else. It felt terrifying and liberating in equal measure. Across town, though I didn't know it yet, Melissa the wedding planner was leaving Claire a voicemail that would be the first crack in my sister's perfect facade. Hi Claire, quick question. I got a call from someone asking about the payment account, and I just want to make sure there's no issue we need to address. Call me back when you get a chance. The machine my father had built to protect me was coming to life, and once it started moving, nothing could stop it. The pre-wedding dinner was scheduled for Friday night, 2 days after I'd filed the paperwork with Ruth. My mother had sent a group text with the details 6 o'clock at her house family, only a chance to celebrate before the chaos of the final wedding preparations. The message had included a note that Mark's parents were out of town, so it would just be us. I almost declined, but something told me I needed to be there. I needed to see Mark up close to understand what kind of man my sister was marrying and why he seemed so interested in our family's property. I stopped at a frame shop on my way and had them put together something simple, a photo of Claire and our father from when she was maybe 10 years old. They were building a birdhouse together in the garage, both of them smiling at the camera. I'd taken that photo. I remembered the day clearly, because it was one of the rare times after his diagnosis, when Dad had been fully present, fully himself. I thought maybe Claire would want to remember that version of him on her wedding day. When I arrived at the house, I could hear voices and laughter coming from inside. I let myself in with the key I'd never returned, carrying the wrapped frame under my arm. The dining room table was set for 5, and my mother was arranging flowers in a vase while Claire and Mark sat close together on the living room sofa, his arm draped casually across her shoulders. "Victoria," my mother said, glancing at me briefly before returning to her flowers. "You're early." I checked my watch. I was exactly on time. I brought something for Claire. I held out the frame. Claire took it without much interest, pulling off the wrapping paper. She looked at the photo for perhaps 3 seconds before setting it on the side table next to a stack of wedding magazines. "Oh, that's nice. Thanks." My mother didn't even look at it. We sat down to dinner shortly after, and I found myself positioned between my mother and an empty chair with Claire and Mark across from me. My mother had made her specialty pot roast, the one she used to make for Sunday dinners when I was young, back when we still pretended to be a normal family. Mark complimented everything effusively, his charm practiced and smooth. He was handsome in a calculated way with expensive haircut and a watch that probably cost more than my monthly rent. "So, Victoria," my mother said as she passed the potatoes. "Still married to your work, I see. No date tonight." The comment landed with casual cruelty. Claire smirked into her wine glass. "I'm still single, yes," I said evenly. 42 and alone, my mother continued as if I hadn't spoken. "I suppose some people are just too rigid for relationships. Men don't appreciate being managed like one of your corporate projects." Mark laughed a little too loud. Now I'm sure Victoria's just selective. Nothing wrong with high standards." But his tone suggested he agreed with my mother's assessment. Claire extended her left hand across the table, letting the overhead light catch the diamond on her finger. It was stunning, easily 2 carats set in what looked like platinum. "Mark has excellent taste," Claire said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "He knew exactly what I wanted." I looked at the ring, then at Mark, then back to the ring. "It's beautiful," I said, because it was. "Very impressive." Mark launched into a story about how he'd chosen it, something about knowing the moment he saw it that it was meant for Claire. I ate my pot roast and let the conversation flow around me. I'd learned years ago that defending myself at these dinners was pointless. My mother would twist anything I said into evidence of my failures, and Claire would pile on because that's what she'd been trained to do. So I stayed quiet and observed. That's when I started noticing things. Mark was talking about their honeymoon plans, something extravagant in Bali, when he casually mentioned getting a few outstanding mortgage considerations sorted out first. He was looking at my mother when he said it, and she went very still for just a moment before taking a long sip of her wine. "What mortgage considerations?" I asked, keeping my tone merely curious. Mark's smooth expression faltered for just a second. "Oh, just some refinancing details. Boring financial stuff. Your mother and I have been working with her accountant to optimize some things." He pivoted quickly. "But that's all handled. The important thing is Claire gets her dream wedding and her dream honeymoon." My mother shot him a look I couldn't quite read. Warning, annoyance. Something was there, some communication passing between them that excluded both Claire and me. Later, when the conversation turned to wedding expenses and how much everything cost, Mark made another comment that stuck in my mind. "It's all about leveraging assets wisely," he said with a knowing smile. "Making your resources work for you. That's something I've learned in real estate. Everything has value if you know how to access it." The phrasing was too specific, too comfortable. This wasn't a man making general conversation about financial planning. This was someone who'd studied my family's finances, who knew details he shouldn't know. My compliance officer instincts kicked into high gear. In my professional life, this kind of familiarity with a client's financial details before there was any legitimate reason to have access was a red flag. A big one. "Mark's so smart about money," Claire gushed. "He's helped Mom understand so many things about the house and investments. I don't know what we would have done without him." I smiled and said nothing, but I was cataloging every word, every glance between Mark and my mother, every hint that there was a layer to this situation I hadn't yet uncovered. When Claire stood to clear plates, she walked around the table and held out her hand to show me the ring up close. "Isn't it perfect?" she asked. And for a moment she sounded like the little sister I used to walk to school, vulnerable and seeking approval. I took her hand, gently angling it toward the light as if admiring the stone. That's when I saw it. Inside the band, barely visible, was an engraving. Not a romantic message or their initials, but what looked like a jeweler's mark followed by a date, 2022, 2 years before this engagement. 2 years before Mark supposedly fell in love with my sister and chose this ring specifically for her. Claire clearly hadn't noticed. The engraving was tiny, the kind of detail you'd miss unless you were looking for it. I pulled out my phone under the pretense of taking a photo. "Let me get a picture," I said. "It's so beautiful." I zoomed in, capturing the engraving clearly, then took a few more shots of the ring from different angles. "You're so sweet," Claire said, pulling her hand back. "You should post it on Facebook. Tag me." "Of course," I lied. I left shortly after dessert, claiming an early morning meeting. No one tried to convince me to stay. As I drove home, my mind was working through the pieces. Mark's comments about the property, his too familiar relationship with my mother, the ring that had belonged to someone else. Something was very wrong here, something beyond simple family dysfunction. My phone buzzed with a text as I pulled into my parking space. It was from Claire. "Why did the wedding planner just email me about payment issues? Do you know anything about this?" The accounts had frozen right on schedule. Ruth's timeline was precise as always. I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "No idea. Have you asked Mom?" Within seconds, my phone started ringing. Claire's name flashed on the screen. I silenced it and went inside. The countdown had reached 0. Now we'd see what my father had really been protecting me from. The freeze went into effect exactly 7 business days after Ruth filed the paperwork, falling on a Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock. I knew the precise moment because Ruth had called me the evening before to confirm. "Tomorrow it becomes official," she'd said. "The bank will process the hold first thing. By noon, vendors will start receiving automated notifications." "Are you somewhere you can lay low for a few days?" I'd taken the week off work telling my supervisor I needed personal time to deal with family matters. It wasn't a lie. I was dealing with family matters, just not in the way anyone would assume. I worked remotely from my apartment laptop open on the dining table phone turned off and tucked in a drawer. I didn't want to see the calls and messages I knew would be coming. Not yet. I needed to let the system work without my interference, without my old instinct to smooth things over and fix everyone's problems kicking in. The account in question, the one ending in 4739, was one my father had opened when I was 22 years old. He'd added me as a joint owner, saying it was important for someone responsible to have access in case of emergency. I'd forgotten about it over the years, especially after his death, when my mother assured me all the accounts had been settled and redistributed appropriately. But the account had never been closed, and my name had never been removed. When Ruth pulled the full banking records there, it was Victoria Ann Whitmore, joint account holder, equal access and authority. With the protective clause now activated and the documented evidence of my systematic exclusion from family events, the bank had no choice but to honor the estate attorney's request for a temporary hold. It wasn't theft. It wasn't revenge. It was the proper legal execution of trust terms that my father had established specifically to protect his assets and, by extension, me. Ruth had been very clear about this. Every step we were taking was not only legal, but carefully designed to withstand any challenge my mother or Claire might bring. The vendors started receiving notifications within hours. I imagined Melissa, the wedding planner, staring at her computer screen in confusion as payment authorization requests bounced back with a message about estate review procedures. The venue coordinator, the caterer, the florist, the photographer. One by one, their scheduled payments were placed on hold pending clarification of account authority. Services wouldn't be canceled immediately, Ruth had explained, but they would pause. Vendors would reach out seeking confirmation. When no confirmation came, they would protect themselves by suspending commitments. I sat in my apartment and watched the October rain streak down my windows, working through compliance reports for my job with methodical precision. This was familiar territory for me, this world of documentation and procedures of systems designed to catch irregularities and protect institutional interests. I'd spent 20 years mastering these systems for corporations. Now I was using those same skills to protect myself. On Wednesday, I hired a licensed estate management company. Their job was simple and entirely legal inventory and secure all items that had belonged to my father and were therefore part of the estate I now controlled. His handmade furniture, his collection of woodworking tools in the garage, boxes of photographs and documents stored in the attic, the bookshelf he'd built for my 10th birthday. Everything that bore his touch, his craftsmanship, his memory. I gave the company very specific instructions. They were not to touch anything belonging to my mother or Claire. Not a dish, not a piece of clothing, not a single item that wasn't explicitly documented as my father's property. I wanted an unassailable legal record. Every item removed would be photographed, cataloged, given an inventory number, and documented with receipts. If this ended up in court, and part of me suspected it would, I needed to prove that I'd followed every rule, honored every boundary taken, only what was legally and rightfully mine. The company worked over 3 days, professional and thorough. I received hourly updates with photos and inventory lists. I kept copies of everything in multiple locations. My laptop, an external hard drive. Ruth's office files, a cloud storage account. Evidence. Always evidence. My compliance training had taught me that documentation was the difference between a strong case and a weak one. Alone in my apartment during those quiet days, I expected to feel something dramatic. Triumph, maybe? Or guilt. Or at least the adrenaline rush of conflict. But what I actually felt was a deep, surprising calm. For the first time in decades, I wasn't managing anyone else's crisis. I wasn't fielding desperate phone calls or rushing to solve problems or absorbing someone else's anger and panic. I was simply sitting still, letting the boundaries I'd established do their work. I found myself thinking about something Ruth had shown me during our first meeting. Tucked into my father's file was a letter he'd written to me to be delivered only if the protective clause was ever activated. Ruth had given it to me in a sealed envelope, and I'd waited until I was home to open it. The letter was short, written in his shaky handwriting from the later stages of his illness. "Vicky," it read, "if you're reading this, it means they pushed you out. I'm so sorry I won't be there to stop it. But please understand, protecting yourself is not the same as being cruel. Don't let them convince you that kindness means self-erasure. You spent your whole life making yourself smaller so they could feel bigger. That ends now. The house is yours. The accounts are yours. Not because you're selfish, but because you earned them by holding everything together when no one else would. Don't apologize for taking up space. Love, Dad." I read those words over and over during those quiet days. Don't let them convince you that kindness means self-erasure. All my life, I'd believed that being good meant being invisible, that love meant endless accommodation, that family meant accepting whatever treatment they chose to give me. My father, even through the fog of his illness, had seen the truth I'd been too close to recognize. I wasn't being cruel. I was finally protecting myself. Across town, though, I wouldn't learn about this until much later. Mark Chen stood in a dim parking garage having a tense conversation with Eric Huang, the accountant, who'd been managing my mother's finances for the past 3 years. Mark's usual charm had evaporated, replaced by barely controlled agitation. "She knows something," Mark hissed, glancing around to make sure they were alone. "The accounts are frozen. The sister Victoria. She's behind this." Eric's face had gone pale. "That's impossible. The paperwork was clean. Your mother-in-law signed everything." "Well, something's gone wrong and we need to figure out what before this whole thing unravels." But it was already too late. The unraveling had begun the moment I'd stopped trying to hold everything together. I returned to the office on Monday, exactly 1 week after the account freeze. I'd given the situation time to percolate, time for the reality to sink in for my mother and Claire. My voicemail was full of messages I hadn't listened to. My phone showed 47 missed calls. I deleted the notifications without reading them and settled into my normal routine, reviewing compliance reports and attending a morning meeting about quarterly audits. I was back at my desk around 11 when my assistant Jeremy buzzed through on the intercom. "Victoria, there's someone here claiming to be your sister. She says it's a family emergency and she needs to see you right now. Security is asking if I should send her up." I paused, fingers hovering over my keyboard. "Let her come." 3 minutes later, Claire burst through my office door without knocking. She looked nothing like the radiant bride-to-be from the dinner a week ago. Her hair was unwashed and pulled into a messy ponytail. Her eyes were swollen and red-rimmed from crying. She wore yoga pants and an oversized sweatshirt, the kind of outfit she'd normally never be caught dead wearing in public. But what I noticed most was the expression on her face, pure incandescent rage, mixed with something that looked almost like fear. "You bitch!" she hissed, her voice shaking. "You absolute bitch! What did you do?" I closed my laptop calmly and folded my hands on my desk. "Hello, Claire. Would you like to sit down?" "Don't you dare act calm." Her voice rose to a near shriek. "The venue called yesterday. They're putting our booking on hold because of payment issues. Then the caterer called, and the florist. And everyone, Victoria, everyone is saying the same thing about the account being frozen and estate reviews, and I don't understand what's happening, but I know you're behind it." She was breathing hard, practically vibrating with fury. Then, in a gesture so theatrical it would have been funny under different circumstances, she yanked the engagement ring off her finger and hurled it across my desk. It hit the polished wood surface with a sharp clink and rolled toward the edge. "You ruined my life," she screamed. "Everything is falling apart, and my wedding is in 2 weeks, and Mark is furious, and Mom won't stop crying, and it's all because of you." I didn't flinch. I watched the ring complete its trajectory, spinning in lazy circles before coming to rest near my stapler. The diamond caught the fluorescent office light, throwing tiny rainbows across the desk surface. I reached out, picked up a tissue from the box by my computer, and used it to carefully lift the ring. Claire watched confused by my caution as I opened my desk's locking drawer and placed the ring inside. I closed the drawer and turned the key. "You told me to disappear," I said quietly. "I'm just following instructions." My calmness seemed to enrage her more than any shouting match would have. "That's not what I meant. You know that's not what I meant." "What did you mean then?" She opened her mouth, then closed it. We both knew exactly what she'd meant. She'd wanted me gone, erased, removed from her perfect narrative. She just hadn't expected me to have the power to actually leave and take something with me when I did. "You'll want that ring back," I said, nodding toward the locked drawer. "Not for the wedding, for evidence." Claire's fury faltered, confusion breaking through. "What are you talking about? Evidence of what?" I met her eyes and kept my voice level. "When you're ready to hear the truth about Mark, call me. Until then, I'm done being your punching bag. I'm done being the person you take your frustrations out on because you know I'll absorb it without fighting back. That version of me doesn't exist anymore." I pulled a business card from my desk organizer and slid it across to her. Ruth Hale's name and contact information were printed in elegant script. "Estate attorney. You'll be hearing from her officially, but you can call her yourself if you want to understand what's actually happening here." Claire stared at the card like it might bite her. "I don't understand any of this." "I know you don't, but that's not my problem to solve for you anymore." She grabbed the card, crumpling it slightly in her fist. "I hate you," she said, but there was less conviction in it now. More confusion than anger. "I know," I said simply. She turned and left, not quite slamming the door, but closing it hard enough that I heard it click shut down the hallway. I sat very still for a moment, feeling my heartbeat gradually slow. That had been harder than I'd expected. Despite everything, despite the erasure from the video and the casual cruelty and the years of being invisible, some part of me still remembered the little girl I'd walked to school every morning. The kid sister who'd once looked up to me before my mother taught her that dismissing me was acceptable. I exhaled slowly and opened my computer to email security. "Jeremy, can you send me the hallway camera footage from the past hour? I need to review something." The footage arrived in my inbox 20 minutes later. I downloaded it and started watching from 10 minutes before Claire arrived. The timestamp showed her getting off the elevator, looking around frantically, then spotting my office door and charging toward it. But that's not what caught my attention. 30 seconds after Claire entered my office, another figure appeared in the frame. Mark Chen, wearing an expensive suit and looking utterly composed, walked down the hallway and stopped about 15 feet from my door. He didn't knock. He didn't try to enter. He simply stood there, head tilted slightly as if listening. The camera angle was perfect. I could see his face clearly, could see the calculation in his expression as he tracked every raised voice, every word that carried through the door. When Claire finally stormed out, mascara running down her face, Mark waited until she'd turned the corner toward the elevators. Then, he followed, maintaining distance, keeping her just barely in sight. He never called out to her, never rushed to comfort her. Just tracked her movements with the focused attention of someone gathering information. I watched the footage 3 more times, noting every detail. Then I saved it to my laptop, copied it to an external hard drive, and uploaded it to my secure cloud storage. 3 separate backups. Always 3 backups. Something about Mark's behavior was deeply wrong. A man genuinely in love with my sister would have burst into my office to defend her, or at least revealed himself when she left to offer comfort. Mark had done neither. He'd observed, he'd listened, he'd gathered intelligence. The question was why? What exactly was Mark Chen's interest in my family, and why did it seem to have so little to do with actual love for Claire? I opened my email and composed a message to Ruth. In the subject line I wrote, "Additional evidence." In the body I attached the security footage and typed one line, "Everything is on camera now." Her response came back within 5 minutes. "Good. Forward anything else unusual. We might need it sooner than expected." I locked my computer and sat back in my chair, looking at the drawer where Claire's ring now rested. That engraving inside the band, the date from 2022, kept nagging at me. There was a story there, a history that Mark hadn't shared with my sister. And if I was right, if my instincts about financial impropriety were correct, that ring might be the key to understanding exactly what kind of man my sister was about to marry. Assuming, of course, that the wedding happened at all. Saturday morning arrived clear and bright, the kind of perfect October day that seemed designed for outdoor weddings. I woke early out of habit, made coffee, and carried my mug out to the small balcony of my apartment. From 6 stories up, I could see the city waking slowly, the streets still quiet in that suspended moment, before the weekend fully begins. I'd brought a book with me, a mystery novel I'd been working through for weeks, and I settled into my chair with no particular agenda for the day. My phone sat on the kitchen counter inside, powered on, but face down. I wasn't hiding from what was about to happen. I simply didn't need to watch it unfold in real time. The first call would have come around 8 in the morning. I knew this because Ruth had walked me through the timeline days earlier, explaining how vendor contracts worked and when final payments typically processed. The venue would have tried to run the final balance at 8 o'clock sharp, their standard procedure for same-day events. When the transaction failed, their automated system would have generated an immediate notification. I imagined Claire's phone ringing while she was probably getting her hair done, surrounded by bridesmaids and champagne and the giddy chaos of wedding morning preparations. I imagined her seeing the venue's number on her screen and answering with a laugh, expecting some minor logistical question about table arrangements or sound system setup. Instead, she would have heard, "Ms. Whitmore, we have a problem. Your final payment hasn't cleared. The transaction was declined with a notice about estate review procedures. Without payment confirmation, we can't proceed with today's event." The caterer would have called next, then the florist, then the photographer. Each one with the same message, the same confusion, the same impossible situation. Payments frozen, services suspended, event canceled. Because it was Saturday, there was no one at the bank who could help. No manager to override the hold, no emergency contact who could resolve estate legal matters. The protective clause Ruth had activated was designed precisely for this scenario, unbreakable on weekends and holidays, requiring multiple signatures and legal review to reverse, impossible to circumvent through charm or tears or urgent pleading. I sipped my coffee and turned a page in my book, though I'll admit I wasn't absorbing much of the plot. Some part of my mind was tracking the timeline, imagining the cascade of disasters happening across town. Guests would be arriving at the venue by 10:30, dressed in their wedding finest, carrying gifts, expecting mimosas and a ceremony. Instead, they'd find locked doors and a hastily scribbled note taped to the entrance. The note would say something generic and apologetic. Event postponed, details to follow. No explanation, no context. Just the sudden, shocking absence of the wedding that was supposed to happen. I thought about all those guests standing in the parking lot, confused and gossiping. I thought about how fast news would travel in our community. How many of those people would immediately pull out their phones and start texting. By noon, half of Portland would know that Claire Whitmore's wedding had imploded spectacularly. By evening, speculation would be rampant. Money problems, family drama, cold feet. The truth would get lost in the noise, but the humiliation would be permanent. My phone started ringing around 9:30. I heard it from the balcony, that insistent buzzing against the kitchen counter. I didn't move to answer it. It rang 5 times, went to voicemail, then started ringing again almost immediately. My mother, I assumed. Or Claire. Or both of them, taking turns, their panic escalating with each unanswered call. When I finally went inside to refill my coffee, I glanced at the screen. 17 missed calls. My mother's name appeared most frequently. I picked up the phone and watched it ring again in my hand, her name flashing on the display. Then I set it back down and returned to the balcony. The next time she called around 10, I answered. I didn't say hello, just held the phone to my ear and waited. "You vindictive, selfish!" My mother's voice was raw with fury, and something else, something that sounded almost like fear. I hung up, not dramatically, just pressed the end call button and set the phone on the small table beside my chair. It rang again within seconds. I let it ring, and ring, and ring. I wasn't hiding. I wasn't blocking her number or turning off my phone. I was simply choosing not to engage with the crisis I hadn't created. For once in my life, someone else's emergency was not my responsibility to fix. The boundaries I'd established were doing exactly what boundaries were supposed to do, protecting my peace while letting natural consequences unfold. My neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, walking her small terrier on the sidewalk below, looked up and waved. I waved back. Later I'd learned that she told her book club I'd seemed remarkably calm, almost serene that morning. Like someone who'd finally made peace with a difficult decision, she'd said. She wasn't wrong. I felt no triumph, no schadenfreude, no dark satisfaction in Claire's public humiliation. What I felt was something quieter and more profound: the absence of obligation. The freedom of not being the person who had to fix everything, absorb everyone's pain, smooth over every crisis. The people who'd erased me from family history were now experiencing their own form of erasure plans, dissolved control, removed the future they'd imagined simply gone. The symmetry was poetic, but I took no joy in it. I just took my space. As afternoon faded into evening, I went inside and composed a text message to Claire. I kept it brief, just one line. "You wanted me to disappear. Consider it done." I didn't elaborate, didn't explain the legal mechanisms or the protective clause or the years of planning my father had put into protecting me. I simply held up a mirror to her own words, letting her see the reflection of what she'd asked for. Then I powered down my phone completely. Not just silenced off. No calls, no emails, no texts, no connection to their chaos. For the next 48 hours, I would be unreachable. I would read my book and cook simple meals and take long walks and exist in the quiet space I'd finally carved out for myself. I'd spent decades reacting to their crises. Now they could react to my silence. And silence, I was learning, was the loudest response of all. Somewhere across town, Claire was staring at my message on her phone screen, her perfect wedding day in ruins around her, finally beginning to understand that actions have consequences and words have weight, and the sister she'd dismissed so casually had more power than any of them had ever imagined. At midnight, my phone powered off, and sitting in a drawer, a text message arrived that I wouldn't see until Monday morning. "Please, I don't understand. What did we do?" But by then, understanding would come too late to stop what was already in motion. I powered my phone back on Monday morning, 2 full days after the wedding that never happened. The screen lit up with a flood of notifications, 73 missed calls, 42 voicemails, and more text messages than I could count without scrolling. I deleted most of them without reading, but one text from Ruth caught my attention. "Estate company finished Saturday. Everything documented. Call when you're ready." I made coffee first, then called her back. "It's done?" I asked. "Completely. They worked all day Saturday while your family was dealing with the venue situation. Every item cataloged, photographed, removed with proper documentation. The house is still livable, but your father's presence has been extracted, legally and thoroughly." She paused. "I left something for them on the dining table. Something your father wanted them to see when they were ready. The album. Among other things. How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," I said, and realized I meant it. "Better than fine, actually." "Good. Because this is just the beginning. When they find what you left, they're going to have questions only you can answer." She was right, of course. But I wasn't ready to provide answers yet. Let them sit with the confusion for a while. Let them feel what it's like when someone else controls the narrative. I learned later through a neighbor who felt compelled to call and tell me everything that my mother and Claire had spent Saturday night at a hotel after the wedding collapse. They couldn't face going home immediately, couldn't bear to see each other or process what had happened. Sunday evening, they'd finally returned to the house, exhausted and shell-shocked, expecting at least the comfort of familiar surroundings. Instead, they walked into a space that felt fundamentally altered. The estate company had done exactly what I'd instructed. They'd removed only items that legally belonged to my father or had been explicitly willed to me in the estate documents. His handmade workshop tools from the garage, The furniture he'd built with his own hands, a bookshelf, a coffee table, a cedar chest. Photo albums he'd assembled over decades. His study desk and chair. His collection of woodworking magazines. The paintings he'd done in the brief period before his diagnosis when he'd taken up art as a hobby. Everything that bore his touch, his craftsmanship, his presence, gone. But my mother's furniture remained. Claire's childhood bedroom was untouched. The kitchen appliances, the dishes, the everyday items they'd accumulated, all still there. The house was still livable, still functional, just hollowed out in ways they hadn't anticipated. The walls showed pale rectangles where his paintings had hung ghosts of color against faded paint. The garage echoed with emptiness where his workbench had stood. The study was a blank room with carpet impressions showing where his desk had been. Receipts and inventory lists were stacked neatly on the dining table, each page documenting every item removed, every legal justification, every timestamp and witness signature. The estate company had even included video documentation showing the careful, methodical removal process. Everything above board, everything legal, everything designed to withstand any challenge they might bring. But that's not what caught their attention first. According to my neighbor's breathless account, Claire had noticed the photo album immediately. It sat in the center of the dining table, a leather-bound volume neither of them recognized. The leather was beautiful, clearly professionally restored with gold lettering embossed on the cover, Victoria and Dad. My mother had opened it carefully and found herself looking at photographs she'd thought were lost or destroyed years ago. Pictures of me and my father, that she'd deliberately misplaced images that didn't fit the narrative she preferred. There I was at 8 years old, helping Dad build a birdhouse in the garage, both of us covered in sawdust and grinning. There I was at 17, holding my acceptance letter to college, while Dad stood beside me, beaming with pride. My college graduation, where my mother hadn't attended, but Dad had driven 3 hours to be there. My first professional award ceremony, where no family came except Dad, who'd sat in the front row and clapped louder than anyone. Page after page of a relationship my mother had tried to erase from family memory, now restored and undeniable. Tucked into the back sleeve of the album was an envelope with my name written across it in Dad's handwriting. Claire had pulled it out, her hands shaking, according to my neighbor who heard this story secondhand from Claire herself. Inside the envelope, a small brass key, a USB drive, and a folded slip of paper with GPS coordinates written in Dad's careful print. There was also a note brief and written in the shakier handwriting from his later years. "Listen to my voice. You were always right to trust your instincts. Protect yourself, Dad." Claire, desperate for answers and past the point of rational decision-making, had grabbed the USB drive and shoved it into her laptop before my mother could stop her. The computer recognized the drive displayed a single video file dated 6 months before Dad's death. But when she tried to open it, a password prompt appeared. The preview image was visible, though Dad sitting in his study, the one that was now an empty room upstairs. He was clearly ill in the video, his face gaunt and his movements careful, but his eyes were focused and lucid. He was looking directly at the camera, speaking to someone with obvious intent and clarity. The timestamp showed the recording was made on a Tuesday afternoon in March, 6 months before he died, during one of his increasingly rare windows of lucidity. Whatever he'd recorded, he'd planned it carefully, had waited for a moment when his mind was clear enough to speak his truth. But the file was locked, password protected, and neither my mother nor Claire had any idea what the password might be. Claire had tried obvious options, my neighbor told me. Dad's birthday, their anniversary, Claire's birthday, the address of the house. Nothing worked. The file remained sealed, its secrets locked away from everyone except the one person who might actually know the answer. Me. My mother had stared at the GPS coordinates, apparently, then looked up the location on her phone. A bank downtown. The same bank where Dad had done his business for 40 years. And then the brass key had slipped from Claire's trembling fingers and fallen to the hardwood floor with a sharp metallic clatter. She'd picked it up and held it to the light, reading the tiny inscription engraved along its shaft, First National Bank Safety Deposit Box. My father had left a trail of breadcrumbs that led directly to me, and only I could follow them to the end. He'd known they'd find these things eventually. He'd counted on their curiosity and their growing desperation, and he'd made sure that every answer they wanted required them to come to me, the daughter they'd erased, the sister they'd dismissed. The key lay on the table between them, small and brass, and holding promises of revelations they weren't sure they wanted to face. But by then it was too late to turn back. I met Ruth at First National Bank Monday morning at 9 o'clock sharp. She was already waiting in the lobby when I arrived, holding a leather portfolio and wearing the expression of someone about to witness something significant. We didn't speak as the bank manager, a polished woman in her 50s named Mrs. Chen, led us down a hallway to the vault area. I handed over the brass key and my identification, along with the slip of paper bearing the GPS coordinates that had led me here. Mrs. Chen checked her records, cross-referenced my ID with the signature card on file, and nodded. Box 447 has been registered in your name since October 2018, Ms. Whitmore. You're listed as the sole authorized accessor. She inserted her master key and my brass key into the twin locks, turned them in sequence, and withdrew a long metal box from its slot in the wall. She led us to a private viewing room and left us alone with the box sitting on the table between us. Ruth gestured for me to open it. My hands were steadier than I expected as I lifted the lid. Inside lay 2 items, a manila folder containing what looked like legal documents and a USB drive identical to the one I'd left for my family to find. Ruth reached for the folder first, pulling out a notarized document with multiple signatures and a county clerk's stamp. "The secondary codicil," she said quietly. "The protective clause in its original form. This is what your father filed with the county, what he wanted preserved in case anyone tried to contest it later." I picked up the USB drive and turned it over in my palm. A small sticky note was attached to its side, my father's handwriting barely legible. "Password hint, your first word." My first word. Family lore had it that while most babies said mama or dada, my first clear word had been dada. According to my father, I'd said it while reaching for him across my crib one morning. He'd told that story dozens of times over the years, always with pride in his voice, always making sure I knew I'd chosen him first. Ruth had brought her laptop. I plugged in the drive and waited for it to load. The password prompt appeared and I typed dada. The file opened immediately. My father's face filled the screen and I felt my breath catch. He looked so much thinner than I remembered, his face hollowed out by illness, but his eyes were clear and focused. The timestamp in the corner showed March 15th, 6 months before he died. He was sitting in his study, the same room that was now empty, the afternoon light coming through the window behind him. "Vicky," he said, and his voice was weaker than I remembered, but unmistakably his. "If you're watching this, it means they pushed you out. It means your mother and Claire finally did what I was afraid they'd do. I'm sorry I won't be there to stop it. I'm sorry I won't be there to tell you in person how proud I am of you, how much you deserved better than what they gave you." He paused, taking a careful breath. "But I can protect you now, even if I can't be there in person. That's what this is. Protection." The video continued, and I listened as my father detailed conversations he'd overheard during the last years of his lucidity. My mother and Claire talking in the kitchen when they thought he was asleep upstairs, discussing how to keep Victoria in line after he was gone, how to make sure she doesn't ask questions about the house or the accounts. They'd assumed he said that my grief would make me compliant, that I'd sign whatever they put in front of me without reading it carefully. "They were planning to pressure you," he said, his voice hardening slightly, "to use your sense of family obligation against you. I couldn't let that happen. So I went to Ruth while I still had good days, while I could still think clearly enough to protect you legally." His face softened. "They'll tell you I didn't love Claire. They'll say I played favorites, that I was cruel to exclude them. That's not true, Vicky. I loved your mother. I loved both my daughters. But love doesn't mean letting people hurt each other without consequences. Claire was learning to be selfish because no one stopped her. Your mother was teaching her that using you was acceptable. I couldn't fix their characters, but I could make sure you had protection when you finally needed it." He leaned closer to the camera. "You've been invisible too long. You've sacrificed too much. This house, these accounts, they're not rewards. They're what you earned by holding everything together when no one else would. Don't let them make you feel guilty for taking what's yours. The house protects you now, because I can't." The video ended. I sat very still, staring at the blank screen, feeling tears I hadn't cried in years burning behind my eyes. Ruth reached over and squeezed my hand once, then released it. "There's more," she said gently. "Your mother needs to see this. Are you ready?" I nodded, and Ruth made a phone call. 30 minutes later, my mother arrived at Ruth's office, escorted by Claire. They both looked exhausted, my mother's face drawn and gray, Claire's eyes still puffy from crying. Ruth had set up her conference room with a laptop and projector. She played the video without preamble, letting my father's words fill the room. I watched my mother's face as she listened, watched the color drain from her cheeks, watched her hands grip the armrests of her chair. When the video ended, Ruth slid the notarized codicil across the table. "This is the document that's been filed with the county since 2018, Ruth said in her professional attorney voice. "It's legal, binding, and uncontestable. Victoria now has sole control of the property and associated accounts." My mother stared at the document like it might transform into something else if she looked long enough. "I buried that," she whispered finally. "After the funeral, you sent me a copy. I destroyed it. I thought if no one ever mentioned it, if we just pretended it didn't exist, it wouldn't be real." "Why?" I asked. My voice came out steadier than I felt. She looked at me, finally really looked at me, and what I saw in her face wasn't anger or defiance. It was shame. "Because you made me feel inadequate. Your competence, your independence, it reminded me every day that I'd failed as a mother. Claire needed me. She was easy to love because she was always asking for help, always requiring rescue. You never needed anything, so I convinced myself you didn't want anything either." "That's not true," I said quietly. "I know." She closed her eyes. "I know that now, but admitting it would have meant facing what I'd done to you all those years. So I chose to believe you didn't need protection, because if you didn't need it, I didn't have to feel guilty for not providing it." It wasn't an apology. It was barely even an acknowledgement, but it was more honesty than she'd given me in decades. Ruth cleared her throat and pulled another document from her portfolio. "There's something else," she said, sliding it across the table. "A second recording dated 3 days before your father died. Victoria, he left instructions that you should decide whether your mother and Claire see this one." I looked down at the document, at my father's signature, at the date that marked nearly the very end of his life. My hand hovered over it. "What's on it?" Claire asked, her voice small. "The truth," Ruth said simply. "All of it." I decided to wait before showing them the second recording. Something about the timing felt important, and I wanted to understand more about Mark Chen before revealing whatever final truth my father had left behind. Ruth agreed, sealing the document back in her files with instructions that only I could authorize its release. Claire received Mark's text message that same afternoon, while she and my mother were still processing everything they'd learned in Ruth's office. I heard about it later from Claire herself in a voicemail she left on my phone around 6 o'clock, her voice raw and breaking. "He ended it," she said, barely coherent through crying. "Just a text. He didn't even call. He said, 'I can't be associated with this situation. My business reputation is at stake.' And then he blocked me. Victoria, he blocked my number. I can't reach him. I don't understand what's happening." The message went on for 3 minutes, dissolving into incoherent sobbing. I listened to it twice, and despite everything, despite the years of dismissal and cruelty, I felt something twist in my chest. Not satisfaction, not vindication, just a tired, sad recognition of what it felt like to realize someone you loved had only been using you. I knew that pain intimately. By the next morning, mutual acquaintances were reporting that Mark had updated all his social media accounts to removed every photo of Claire and was already actively messaging other women. The speed of it was almost comical in its cruelty. No mourning period, no pretense of heartbreak. Just an immediate pivot to the next opportunity, as if the past year with Claire had been nothing more than a business venture that hadn't panned out. His mask had dropped completely, and everyone could see what had been underneath all along, a man for whom love was transactional, relationships were strategic, and people were resources to be leveraged. But Claire wasn't the only one suffering social consequences. The rumor mill in our community had ignited with spectacular speed. By Tuesday, everyone had a theory about what had really happened. Some blamed Claire for being spoiled and entitled, suggesting she'd finally pushed her long-suffering sister too far. Others painted me as cold and vindictive, a bitter older sister who couldn't stand to see Claire happy. The truth, nuanced and complicated, got lost entirely in the noise of speculation. I watched it unfold from a distance, monitoring social media, without engaging hearing snippets through colleagues who knew my family. Claire's Instagram, which had been a carefully curated shrine to her perfect engagement, went completely dark. Her last post, a photo of her engagement ring with the caption, "3 weeks until forever," remained up like a monument to dreams that had collapsed. Friends who'd commented with heart emojis and congratulations now quietly unfollowed. Wedding gifts began appearing back on doorsteps, returned without explanation or note. The community that had celebrated her engagement now treated her like a cautionary tale. She was experiencing in days what I'd lived with for years: the isolation of being talked about but never talked to, of being the subject of gossip, but never the recipient of genuine concern, of watching your social world contract until you're left with the echo chamber of your own thoughts. I didn't take pleasure in it. I just recognized it. Meanwhile, I'd taken Claire's engagement ring to a jeweler I'd worked with before, a meticulous older man named Bernard, who specialized in estate appraisals. I'd told him I needed a complete evaluation, including any markings or engravings that might reveal the ring's history. Bernard spent 20 minutes examining the ring under magnification before he looked up at me with raised eyebrows. "This is interesting," he said, turning the ring so I could see the inside of the band. "There's an inscription here that's been partially buffed out, but you can still read it under the right light." He showed me through his jeweler's loupe. The engraving was faint but unmistakable, "To Amanda Forever MC." "Amanda?" I asked. Bernard pulled up his records on his computer. "This ring was originally purchased from our shop in 2022. The buyer was Mark Chen. He had it engraved for someone named Amanda. I remember because he was very specific about the wording." He scrolled through his files. Here he came back 6 months later, asking if we could remove the engraving. We explained that completely removing it would damage the band, but we could buff it down to be less visible. He agreed. "And then gave it to my sister," I said quietly. "Apparently so." Bernard printed out the full documentation, the original purchase receipt, the engraving request, the modification order, everything. "I can provide you with certified copies if you need them for any legal purpose." I took the documents, added them to the growing file Ruth and I were building, and felt another piece of the puzzle click into place. Mark hadn't just been careless or sentimental. He'd been calculating. He'd recycled a ring from a previous relationship, saving money while maintaining the appearance of devotion. He was a man who treated symbols of love like used furniture, functional, transferable, ultimately meaningless beyond their utility. This wasn't romance. It was transaction. And it connected to something larger that I was only beginning to understand. Claire had been a Mark, not a fiancé. The question was what exactly Mark had been trying to access through her, and how deep his connection to our family's finances actually went. I was at my apartment that evening reviewing Bernard's documentation and cross-referencing it with the financial records Ruth had pulled when my email notification chimed. A new message sender address, just a string of random numbers and letters. No subject line. I opened it cautiously. The message contained only one line: "Stop digging or disappear for real." I stared at the screen, my compliance training immediately cataloging the threat. Anonymous email. Vague but unmistakable menace. Sent after I'd started examining Mark's background and financial connections. Someone was watching what I was doing, tracking my investigation, and they were worried enough to threaten me. I forwarded the email to Ruth immediately with a note, "We're getting close to something. Someone's scared." Her response came back in less than 5 minutes. "Screenshot everything. Forward to me. Don't delete. We need to document this. Also call Detective Alvarez at Portland PD. I'm sending you her direct number, Financial Crimes Division. She needs to see what we're building." I saved the email, took multiple screenshots, and backed everything up to 3 separate locations. Then I sat very still in my apartment thinking about that phrase, disappear for real. Someone wanted me gone. The question was whether that someone was Mark acting alone, or if there were others involved in whatever scheme he'd been running. Either way, they'd just made a critical mistake. They'd confirmed that there was something worth hiding, something worth threatening someone over. And in my experience, people only threaten you when you're about to expose something they desperately need to keep buried. I forwarded the threatening email to Detective Sarah Alvarez, as Ruth had instructed, then filed a formal report with Portland PD. Alvarez called me within hours, her voice professional but interested. "Financial crimes that escalate to threats usually mean we're dealing with something more organized than a simple family dispute," she said. "Keep documenting everything. Don't engage with anonymous contacts. And let me know immediately if you receive any other threats." I promised I would then try to return to some semblance of normal life. But 2 weeks after the wedding collapse, my mother made a move I should have anticipated but somehow hadn't. Ruth called me on a Wednesday afternoon. "Your mother's hired an auction company," she said without preamble. "They're advertising a public estate sale for this Saturday, the house and contents. I'm looking at the ad in the Oregonian right now. Historic Portland home, estate auction." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "She can't do that. She doesn't have the authority." "I know. But she either doesn't understand that or doesn't care. The auction company is legitimate. They've done their due diligence with what they think are proper ownership documents. Your mother's convinced them she has the right to sell. What do? We file an emergency stop sale order. I can have it ready by tomorrow morning. But Victoria, this is going to be public. Very public. Your mother's invited half the community. Antique dealers, real estate investors, neighbors who are just curious. When that sale gets stopped, it won't be quiet." I thought about my mother standing on the porch of that house, watching her desperate plan collapse in front of dozens of witnesses. Part of me recoiled from causing that kind of public humiliation. But another part, the part that had been erased from family videos and told to disappear, understood that sometimes consequences needed to be visible to be real. "File it," I said. Ruth worked through Thursday, and by Friday evening she'd secured a court order. A judge had reviewed the protective trust clause documents, confirmed their legitimacy, and issued an injunction halting the sale. The county clerk stamped it official. A sheriff's deputy was assigned to serve notice at the auction itself, ensuring maximum legal clarity and creating an official record of the attempted illegal sale. Saturday morning, I woke early and drove to Forest Park. I'd learned something important over the past few weeks. True power wasn't about being present for every confrontation. It was about building systems strong enough to work without you. The law was my proxy now. I didn't need to stand in my mother's driveway and argue. I just needed to let the legal protections my father had built do exactly what they were designed to do. I spent the morning hiking the Wildwood Trail, my phone turned off and tucked in my backpack. The October air was crisp and clean, the forest quiet except for birdsong and the rustle of wind through Douglas firs. I thought about my father, about how he'd loved these woods, how he'd taught me to identify trees by their bark and birds by their calls. He'd been planning ahead even then, I realized. Teaching me to find peace in solitude, to be comfortable with my own company, to understand that being alone wasn't the same as being abandoned. I learned later through Ruth's detailed account and through neighbors who'd been there exactly how the auction had unfolded. By 10 o'clock Saturday morning, more than 50 people had gathered in the front yard. Antique dealers with clipboards, real estate investors evaluating the property's bones, neighbors who'd known my family for decades, drawn by curiosity and the irresistible pull of witnessing drama firsthand. The auction company had set up a podium on the porch, and my mother stood nearby wearing a navy dress and too much makeup trying to project confidence, while Claire hovered in the background looking hollow and defeated. The auctioneer, a jovial man with a booming voice, had just begun his pitch about the home's original hardwood floors and architectural details when a sheriff's deputy pulled up in a marked patrol car. The crowd's attention shifted immediately. The auctioneer paused mid-sentence as the deputy walked up the front steps, official documents in hand. "Excuse me," the deputy said, his voice carrying across the yard. "I need to halt these proceedings immediately." The murmuring started, then rippling through the crowd like wind through grass. The deputy unfolded the court order and read it aloud, his tone formal and bureaucratic. "By order of the Multnomah County Circuit Court, this sale is hereby enjoined. The property is under legal dispute. The individual representing herself as having authority to sell does not possess the legal right to proceed. This auction is concluded." He handed the paperwork to my mother, who took it with shaking hands. I was told later that the color drained from her face as she read the official county seal, the judge's signature, the legal language that made it clear she'd just attempted to sell property she didn't own. Neighbors pulled out phones, some recording video, others texting friends who hadn't attended. The auctioneer looked bewildered, checking his own paperwork, as if it might suddenly reveal different information. The antique dealers and investors began dispersing immediately, professional enough to recognize when a situation had become legally complicated beyond their involvement. The humiliation was public, legal, and absolute. There was no screaming match, no dramatic confrontation, no opportunity for my mother to spin the narrative in her favor. Just the cold, impersonal machinery of justice doing exactly what it was designed to do, protecting legal property rights and halting unauthorized sales. My mother stood on that porch and watched her attempt to escape and start fresh crumble into public failure. Claire, according to witnesses, simply turned and walked back into the house without a word. The crowd dispersed within 15 minutes, leaving behind only the awkward silence of a spectacle that had ended anticlimactically but devastatingly. Ruth called me around noon as I was finishing my hike. "It's done," she said simply. "The sale was stopped. Your mother was served. Everyone saw it." "How is she?" "Honestly, I think she's finally understanding what she's up against." As Ruth was packing up her files at the courthouse later that afternoon, an older man approached her. He was perhaps 70, well-dressed, in a way that suggested success without ostentation, and he carried himself with quiet dignity. "Excuse me," he said. "I was at the auction this morning. I'm looking for information about Victoria Whitmore. I knew her father years ago, and I'd like to help if she needs it." Ruth, ever the protective attorney, was cautious. "What kind of help?" The man reached into his wallet and pulled out a business card. "My name is Thomas Chen. I work in community development. Victoria's father co-signed a loan for me 25 years ago when no one else would. My business would have failed without him. I've been successful since then, and I've always wanted to repay that debt. If Victoria's planning to do something with that house, something good, I have resources and experience I'd like to offer." Ruth took the card, studying it carefully. Thomas Chen, Community Development Specialist. A Portland address. References that would be easy to verify. "I'll pass this along to her," Ruth said, "but I can't promise anything." "I understand. Just tell her this: her father believed in second chances and building things that last. If she inherited that vision, I'd consider it an honor to help her realize it." Ruth called me that evening and told me about the encounter. "Do you want me to run a background check?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "But something tells me he's legitimate." "Your instincts have been good so far." I looked at the business card she'd photographed and texted to me. Thomas Chen. A name that meant nothing to me but apparently everything to my father once upon a time. Another piece of my father's legacy reaching across years to offer protection I hadn't known I'd need. The threats began in earnest after the auction. The first came Monday evening, another anonymous email from a different randomized address. "You've made powerful people angry. Stop now while you still can." Tuesday brought a text message from a burner number I didn't recognize. Accidents happen to people who don't know when to quit. Wednesday, I found a plain white envelope that had been slipped under my apartment door, no postage or return address. Inside a single typed line, "Back off or regret it." I didn't panic. Years of compliance work had trained me to recognize patterns and respond systematically rather than emotionally. I documented everything. Screenshots of the emails with full headers showing routing information, photos of the text messages with timestamps, the physical letter which I handled only with gloves and sealed in a plastic bag to preserve any potential fingerprints. I forwarded copies to Ruth and then called the non-emergency police line to file a formal report. The responding officer took my statement and suggested I speak directly with Detective Sarah Alvarez in the Financial Crimes Division, the same detective Ruth had recommended earlier. "She's been asking about cases involving estate fraud and real estate schemes," the officer said. "Your situation might connect to something she's already investigating." I met Alvarez at a coffee shop Thursday morning. She was in her mid-40s with sharp eyes and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that comes from years of dealing with people who lie for a living. I brought everything. The threatening messages, Bernard's documentation about the ring, the security footage of Mark lurking outside my office, the financial records Ruth had compiled showing Eric's involvement with my family's accounts. Alvarez spread it all across the table, reviewing each piece methodically. When she finished, she looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Threats like these usually mean you're close to something big," she said. "People don't threaten unless they're scared, and they're only scared when exposure will cost them significantly. What exactly have you found?" I walked her through everything. Mark's sudden abandonment of Claire, the recycled engagement ring, Eric's convenient role as family accountant, the way Mark had seemed too familiar with our family's financial details, the anonymous warnings that started the moment I began asking questions. Alvarez made notes, occasionally asking for clarification, her pen moving steadily across her notepad. "This isn't just family drama," she said finally. "This looks like a pattern. Let me run some background checks." She called me back that evening with results that made my suspicions feel suddenly frighteningly validated. Mark Chen had two previous aliases, Mark Chang and Michael Chen. Under those names, he had a history of small-scale real estate fraud in California and Nevada. Nothing major enough to land him in prison, but enough to establish a clear pattern of targeting vulnerable people, gaining access to their assets, and disappearing before consequences caught up with him. More significantly, Alvarez had found Mark's ex-wife, a woman named Amanda Liu, who'd filed a restraining order against him 2 years ago. Amanda had also filed a fraud complaint, though it had been dropped due to insufficient evidence. She claimed he manipulated her into refinancing her family's property, then siphoned funds through a series of shell companies, Alvarez explained. She couldn't prove it at the time, but she might be willing to talk now if it helps build a case. Eric Huang's background was equally revealing. He'd had his CPA license suspended in California 5 years ago for misappropriating client funds. He'd moved to Oregon, set up shop as an unlicensed financial advisor, and apparently partnered with Mark to target families with aging parents and complicated estate situations. "You stumbled into something bigger than family drama," Alvarez said. "This is organized fraud. These men work together, identify vulnerable targets, gain trust, and systematically drain assets. Your family wasn't their first victim, and if we don't stop them, they won't be the last." She got approval from her lieutenant to place me under protective surveillance and to open a formal investigation into Mark and Eric's financial activities. She also requested monitoring of their communications, though that would require additional warrants. "I need you to cooperate fully," she told me. "If either of them contacts you, I need to know immediately. If your mother or Claire mention anything about their finances or any new schemes Eric is proposing, document it. Would you be willing to wear a recording device if necessary?" I didn't hesitate. "Yes, whatever you need." That night, sitting in Alvarez's office, reviewing the full scope of what we'd uncovered, I felt something shift in my understanding of the past few months. This had never been just about me being excluded from a wedding or erased from family videos. Those had been symptoms, not causes. The real story was about predators who'd identified my family as Mark's a widow, with poor financial literacy, a younger daughter hungry for validation, and an older daughter trained to stay silent and accommodate. My father had seen it coming. Maybe not the specific details, maybe not Mark and Eric by name, but he'd recognized the vulnerability. He'd built legal protections knowing that someday someone would try to exploit the family dynamics he couldn't fix. And now I was finishing what he'd started not out of revenge, but out of something clearer and more purposeful. They thought I'd stay silent, I told Alvarez as we compiled documents into evidence folders. That's what I've always done. That's what I was trained to do. But silence isn't submission anymore. It's strategy. Alvarez looked up from her paperwork and smiled slightly. Then let's build an unbreakable case. Let's make sure these men don't do this to anyone else. She pulled up a case file on her computer, scrolling through old complaints and reports. I'm going to get a warrant to examine that ring more closely, she said. There's something about the engraving, the date, the way it connects to Amanda's original fraud complaint. She clicked on a scanned document, squinting at the details. Wait, look at this. She turned the screen toward me. Amanda's fraud complaint from 2 years ago included a photo of documentation she'd kept receipts, bank statements, and a photograph of the engagement ring Mark had given her. In the margins of the complaint, someone had written a case reference number. Alvarez zoomed in on the photograph of the ring, then pulled up the photos I'd taken of Claire's ring for comparison. The engraving, she said quietly. It's not just a date. Look at the numbers more carefully. I leaned closer. What I'd thought was 2022 wasn't a date at all. It was a reference number partially buffed away, but still visible under magnification 220847. Alvarez pulled up another file. That's the case number from Amanda's complaint. He had the case number engraved inside the ring, like a trophy or maybe insurance or just sheer arrogance. She sat back, shaking her head in disbelief. He's been carrying evidence of his own crimes around with him, giving it to his victims. That's either incredibly stupid or incredibly confident that no one would ever look close enough to notice. He didn't count on someone like me, I said quietly. No, Alvarez agreed. He definitely didn't count on you. Alvarez had Claire's engagement ring transferred to a forensic jeweler the department worked with regularly, a woman named Dr. Helena Frost, who specialized in examining jewelry for criminal investigations. 2 days later, Dr. Frost invited us to her lab to review her findings. The ring sat under a high-powered microscope projected onto a large screen, so we could see every detail magnified 50 times its actual size. The inscription to Amanda is clear, Dr. Frost said, adjusting the focus. But what's more interesting is this. She pointed to a series of numbers etched in microscopic text along the inner band. This is a serial number that links to the original purchase. I traced it through industry databases. She pulled up a receipt on her computer. The ring was purchased in March 2022 from a high-end jeweler in downtown Portland. The payment method was a corporate credit card registered to Cascade Holdings LLC. Alvarez leaned forward. Can you trace that company? I can give you the account information. The rest is your department. Dr. Frost handed over a certified report documenting everything she'd found, including photographs and chemical analysis, proving the ring's authenticity and age. Back at Alvarez's office, we dug into Cascade Holdings. The company had been registered in Oregon in 2021, with Mark Chen listed as managing member and Eric Huang as financial officer. The articles of incorporation included forged partnership documents and falsified business references. The corporate account had been used to make multiple purchases that appeared legitimate on the surface but were funded through money that had been systematically drained from client accounts Eric managed. The ring wasn't just recycled, Alvarez said, staring at the screen. It was purchased with stolen money given to Amanda as part of the con, then taken back and given to your sister. He's been using the same props in different performances. Everything clicked into focus. My exclusion from the family hadn't been personal cruelty, though it had felt that way. It had been operational necessity. I was the one person in my family with financial literacy and professional training in spotting fraud. As long as I was involved in family decisions, asking questions, and reviewing documents, Mark and Eric couldn't operate freely. They needed me gone, marginalized, dismissed as vindictive and unreasonable. The wedding video that erased me wasn't just casual meanness. It was psychological warfare designed to isolate me from the family I might have protected. Alvarez spent the next week tracking down Amanda Liu in Seattle. When Amanda agreed to meet with us, we drove north on a gray November morning and found her in a quiet coffee shop near Pike Place Market. She was in her late 30s, pretty in an understated way, with watchful eyes that suggested hard-won caution. "I knew someone would come eventually," Amanda said after we'd introduced ourselves. "Mark leaves a trail. He can't help himself." Over the next 2 hours, Amanda told us her story. Mark had targeted her family 3 years ago, presenting himself as a real estate investment advisor. He'd courted her with the same calculated charm he'd used on Claire. Studied her family dynamics, identified her mother's financial insecurity and her own desire for approval. He'd convinced her to co-sign refinancing documents on her family's property, promising better terms and investment opportunities. Then he'd systematically drained the accounts with Eric's help, moving money through shell companies until it was nearly impossible to trace. "He studies families," Amanda said, her voice quiet but steady. "He finds the weak points, someone desperate for love or validation, someone eager to please. Claire was perfect for him, young, trusting, hungry for a fairy tale. And your mother, he knew exactly how to play her too. The desire to appear successful, to have the perfect family story." Amanda had kept everything: bank statements, emails, recordings of phone conversations she'd made after she'd started suspecting something was wrong. "I couldn't prove it alone," she said, sliding a thick folder across the table. "The police said it was a civil matter. My lawyer said we didn't have enough evidence. But maybe together we can finish what I started." With Amanda's documentation added to what we'd already compiled, Alvarez brought in forensic accountants from the state attorney general's office. Over the next 3 weeks, they traced Cascade Holdings' activities across Oregon. The scheme was larger than any of us had imagined. Mark and Eric had targeted at least 8 families over the past 4 years, always following the same pattern. Eric would position himself as a trusted family accountant, gain access to estate documents and financial records, identify vulnerable assets, and then Mark would enter through a romantic relationship or business partnership. Together, they'd drain accounts through refinancing schemes, fake investment opportunities, and real estate transactions that existed only on paper. The total estimated fraud was $2.3 million. Victoria's family was just one target among many, and we'd caught the scheme before they could complete their planned extraction. I sat in Alvarez's office looking at a chart that connected all 8 families, seeing the pattern repeated with slight variations each time. I wasn't just protecting myself anymore. I'd become the whistleblower who could bring down an organized operation that had destroyed multiple families' financial security. "There's one more thing you need to see," Alvarez said, pulling up a bank transfer record. She turned the screen toward me. "This transaction was processed 1 week before your sister's wedding was supposed to happen." I stared at the numbers. $85,000 transferred from my family's account to Cascade Holdings, LLC. The memo line read, "Property refinancing final payment." "They were going to take everything," I said quietly. The wedding was just cover. One more big distraction while they cleaned out whatever was left. Alvarez nodded. "Your father's protective clause stopped them just in time. Another week, and this money would have disappeared into offshore accounts we'd never recover." I thought about my father, about his foresight, and his quiet protection reaching across years to save not just me, but potentially dozens of other families these men would have targeted next. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about justice, and it was about making sure Mark and Eric never got the chance to do this to anyone else. "What's next?" I asked. Alvarez closed the file with a decisive snap. "Now we build the case that puts them in prison." Building the case took 6 weeks of meticulous work. Ruth Alvarez and I met nearly every day, compiling documentation into a comprehensive dossier that would be impossible to refute or dismiss. We started with my father's video testimony, the recording where he'd explained his fears and his protections. We included the dual will structure with its protective clause notarized and county filed. Dr. Frost's forensic analysis of the ring went in along with the purchase records linking it to Cascade Holdings. Amanda's bank statements, emails, and recordings provided a clear pattern of Mark's methodology. We added transfer records showing unauthorized movements of funds, Eric's suspended CPA license from California, documentation of Mark's multiple aliases, and the security footage of him lurking outside my office door. Every document was notarized. Every page was time-stamped. Everything was cross-referenced with source materials and witness statements. Ruth insisted on redundancy, creating multiple backup copies and ensuring that every claim could be traced back to primary evidence. "If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right," she said. "No holes, no weak points. Weak. No room for their attorneys to maneuver." I never once considered leaking information to the media or posting about it on social media. The temptation was there, especially when I thought about how the community had gossiped and judged without knowing the full story. But I'd built my career on following proper procedures, on letting institutions work the way they were designed to work. My role was to provide irrefutable evidence and then step back, letting the district attorney's office, the state financial crimes division, and the IRS do what they were equipped to do. We submitted the complete dossier on a Tuesday in mid-November. Ruth hand-delivered copies to the appropriate offices, getting signed receipts for everything. "This is the most thorough financial fraud case I've seen in 20 years, she told me afterward. "If they can't prosecute based on this, they can't prosecute based on anything." The media attention came organically without any effort on my part. A local investigative journalist named Marcus Webb, who covered courthouse filings for the Oregonian, noticed the case when it was formally entered into the system. His article ran the following Sunday: "Daughter uncovers family's role in multi-state fraud ring." But unlike the gossip and speculation that had circulated earlier, Webb's reporting was measured and fact-based. He focused on the systemic nature of the fraud, the pattern of targeting vulnerable families, the sophisticated methods Mark and Eric had used to exploit financial illiteracy and family dynamics. Webb requested an interview with me, as did 2 other journalists and a local television station. I declined all of them, instead issuing a single statement through Ruth. "This case is about protecting vulnerable families from predatory financial schemes. It's not about personal grievances or family drama. The evidence speaks for itself, and I trust our legal system to pursue justice appropriately." The framing shifted almost immediately. Instead of being portrayed as a vindictive sister seeking revenge, I was now being discussed as a whistleblower who'd acted with integrity and followed proper channels. People who'd gossiped about me earlier began reassessing their judgments. I received messages from acquaintances I hadn't heard from in years, some apologizing for believing rumors, others thanking me for exposing criminals who might have targeted their own families. The investigation also revealed something I hadn't fully understood: my mother had been as much a victim as a perpetrator. The forensic accountants traced the documents she'd signed, and it became clear that Eric had systematically manipulated her over the course of 3 years. He'd exploited her pride and her desperate need to appear financially successful. He'd used complex language and deliberate confusion to get her signature on refinancing documents, loan applications, and property liens she didn't fully comprehend. She'd been targeted specifically because Eric recognized her as someone whose vanity would override her caution, whose fear of appearing ignorant would prevent her from asking clarifying questions. She wasn't a co-conspirator. She was a mark, just like Amanda had been, just like the other families. The difference was that she'd also been cruel to me for decades, had created the family dynamics that made her such an easy target. Eric and Mark hadn't created her jealousy or her favoritism toward Claire. They'd simply recognized those weaknesses and exploited them expertly. I felt a complicated mixture of emotions when Alvarez showed me the evidence of my mother's manipulation. There was vindication. Yes, a bitter satisfaction in knowing I'd been right to suspect something was wrong. But there was also sadness, a recognition that my mother's worst traits had been weaponized against her by men who studied human weakness for profit. She was a bully who'd made my childhood miserable, but she was also a woman with limited financial education who'd been systematically deceived by professionals who knew exactly how to play her. It didn't excuse what she'd done to me. It didn't erase the years of dismissal and cruelty, but it added a layer of complexity I hadn't expected, a reminder that people can be both perpetrators of harm and victims of exploitation simultaneously. I was at home one evening in late November reviewing documents for the upcoming preliminary hearing when my phone buzzed with a text message. My mother's name appeared on the screen. I stared at it for a long moment before opening the message. "Can we talk just once? Just us?" I set the phone down and walked to my window, looking out at the city lights beginning to glow in the early winter darkness. Part of me wanted to ignore the message to maintain the boundaries I'd finally established. Another part, the part that remembered being 16 and trying so hard to hold everything together, wondered if there was something that needed to be said before this all went to trial. I picked up the phone and typed a response. When and where? Her reply came within seconds. Tomorrow, Laurelhurst Park, the bench by the pond, just us, no lawyers, please. I stared at that last word. Please. I couldn't remember the last time my mother had said please to me about anything. I typed back, 2:00, I'll be there. Whatever happened next, at least I'd know I'd given her the chance to say whatever she needed to say. Not for her sake necessarily, but for mine. Because part of moving forward meant understanding where I'd been, even the parts that had hurt the most. I arrived at Laurelhurst Park 15 minutes early and chose a bench overlooking the pond, watching ducks glide across water that reflected the gray November sky. I'd told myself I wouldn't have expectations for this conversation, but that was a lie. Part of me still hoped for something I couldn't quite name. An apology, maybe. Or at least an acknowledgement that the past 30 years had been as painful for me as they'd been invisible to her. My mother arrived exactly at 2:00, walking slowly across the grass, like someone afraid of stumbling. She looked smaller than I remembered older. The past few months had carved lines into her face that hadn't been there before. She sat down beside me without meeting my eyes, folding her hands in her lap, in a gesture that looked almost like prayer. We sat in silence for a full minute before she spoke. "I was jealous of you," she said finally, her voice so quiet I had to lean closer to hear. "Your competence, your independence, the way you handled everything without falling apart. It made me feel like a failure as a mother. Like if you didn't need me, it proved I'd done something wrong." I waited, letting the silence stretch. I'd learned that silence could be more powerful than any response. "The favoritism toward Claire," she continued, staring at the pond. "It wasn't really love, not the way it should have been. It was compensation." She took a shaky breath. "There was another baby, between you and Claire, a daughter. She was stillborn at 32 weeks. I never told you because by the time you were old enough to understand, I'd already buried it so deep I couldn't talk about it without breaking completely." I felt something cold settle in my chest. A sister I'd never known existed. When we had Claire 3 years later, I saw her as a second chance. A way to not fail again. But I was so focused on not losing her, on being the mother I couldn't be to the baby I lost, that I stopped seeing you at all. You were already so capable, already holding everything together. I convinced myself you didn't need me. She finally looked at me, her eyes red. But that was easier than admitting I didn't know how to be what you needed. It wasn't a full apology. There was still defensiveness woven through her words, still an undercurrent of self-justification. But it was more honesty than she'd given me in decades, more acknowledgement than I'd ever thought I'd receive. I let her words settle before responding. "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting," I said, carefully choosing each word with precision. "It doesn't mean pretending you didn't hurt me or that the past 30 years didn't happen. I needed a mother, and you gave me blame and invisibility instead." She flinched but didn't interrupt. "I don't hate you," I continued, "but I can't save you from the consequences of your choices. You let Eric manipulate you because you cared more about appearances than truth. You signed documents you didn't understand because asking questions would have meant admitting you didn't know something. That's not my fault, and it's not my responsibility to fix. My voice was steady, not cruel, just clear. I'll help you understand the legal process. I'll make sure you're not homeless or destitute, but I won't lie to protect you. I won't pretend this didn't happen. Not anymore. She nodded slowly, tears sliding down her cheeks silently. I know, she whispered. I know I don't deserve even that much. It wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't the emotional reunion that movies promised, or the healing breakthrough that therapy articles suggested was possible. It was just two damaged people sitting on a park bench, finally being honest about the wreckage between them. It was something, though. Something more than we'd had before. As we stood to leave, both of us stiff from sitting in the cold, my mother reached into her purse and pulled out a small metal lockbox. I want you to have this, she said, pressing it into my hands. I should have given it to you years ago. I opened it carefully. Inside was a stack of cash, mostly 20s and 50s, bound with rubber bands. I counted quickly. $12,000. Beneath the money was an envelope yellowed with age. I pulled out the single sheet of paper inside and recognized my mother's handwriting, though the script was steadier than it had been in recent years. The date at the top was from 7 years ago, shortly before my father's diagnosis had progressed to the point where he could no longer live at home. The letter was brief. If I ever lose myself completely, use this to start over. Don't come back for me. Don't let my weakness become your prison. You deserve better than I gave you. Mom! I stared at the words, reading them twice, then a third time. My mother had known, at least in that moment years ago, what she was doing to me. She'd had enough self-awareness to recognize her own toxicity, enough clarity to give me an escape route. But she'd buried that awareness, locked it in a box with money she'd saved in secret, and never mentioned it until now. It didn't undo the damage. It didn't erase the years of being erased. But it showed me that beneath all the cruelty and jealousy, there had been a flicker of the person she might have been if she'd been brave enough to face her own pain, instead of projecting it onto me. Thank you, I said quietly, closing the box. She nodded, wiping her eyes with a tissue. Your father would be proud of you. I need you to know that even if I never said it. He always saw you clearly. I wish I had. We walked back to our cars without speaking again. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't dilute the fragile honesty we'd managed to achieve. As I drove home, the lockbox sitting in the passenger seat beside me, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not closure exactly, but a kind of settled sadness that felt cleaner than the anger I'd carried for so long. My phone rang as I pulled into my parking space. Alvarez's name appeared on the screen. I answered immediately. Victoria, we've arrested Claire, she said without preamble. She was picked up this morning. But here's the thing, she wants to cooperate. She says she has evidence we didn't know existed. Recordings, documents, things she kept because she didn't trust Mark even when she was still planning to marry him. I sat very still, processing this information. What kind of evidence? She won't say until she has immunity guarantees in writing. But Victoria, she's terrified. Whatever she has, it's significant enough that she thinks it'll keep her out of prison. Can you come down to the station? She's asking for you. I looked at the lockbox, then at my reflection in the rearview mirror. The sister who'd told me to disappear now wanted my help. I'll be there in 20 minutes, I said, and started the car again. The trial began on a Monday morning in early December, 3 months after the wedding collapse. I arrived at the Multnomah County Courthouse with Ruth, both of us carrying organized files, and the calm demeanor that comes from knowing your case is airtight. The courtroom was fuller than I'd expected. Victims' families from the other cases Alvarez had uncovered, journalists with notebooks, neighbors who'd followed the story from gossip to legal proceedings, and a handful of curious onlookers drawn by the local media coverage. I sat in the gallery, not at the plaintiff's table. I was a witness in this case, not a prosecutor. The actual work of justice belonged to the district attorney's office, and I was content to let them do it. Mark Chen and Eric Huang sat at the defense table with their respective attorneys, both men looking considerably less polished than when I'd first met them. Mark's expensive watch was gone, replaced by something plain. Eric kept his eyes down, studying papers as if they might offer escape. The charges were read: wire fraud, identity theft, conspiracy to commit financial crimes across state lines. Federal charges, serious ones carrying potential sentences of 5 to 10 years. The prosecution's case unfolded with methodical precision over 3 days. Evidence appeared on courtroom screens in careful sequence: Dr. Frost's forensic analysis of the engagement ring, corporate documents showing Cascade Holdings' fraudulent structure bank transfer records, displaying the systematic theft, my father's video testimony explaining why he'd created protective measures, Amanda's documentation of her own victimization by the same scheme. It was almost boring in its thoroughness, fact layered upon fact with no dramatic flourishes or theatrical moments. Just data, testimony, certified documents, expert witnesses explaining financial mechanisms in language the jury could understand. Mark and Eric's defense attorneys made attempts to challenge the evidence, suggesting misunderstandings and coincidences. But their arguments grew weaker as the prosecution's case built into an irrefutable narrative. By the third day, even the defense looked defeated. On the fourth day, the prosecution called a witness. I hadn't expected Claire. She walked to the stand looking nothing like the radiant bride-to-be from 3 months ago. She'd lost weight, her face pale and drawn, wearing a simple navy dress with no jewelry or makeup. Her hands shook slightly as she was sworn in. From my seat in the gallery, I could see her searching the courtroom until her eyes found mine. I kept my expression neutral, offering neither encouragement nor condemnation. The prosecutor approached gently. "Ms. Whitmore, can you tell the court what you're holding?" Claire lifted a worn leather journal and a USB drive. "I kept a journal during my engagement," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I recorded some of our conversations. I told myself it was because I wanted to remember everything, but really, I think part of me knew something was wrong." Over the next hour, Claire's testimony dismantled whatever remained of Mark's defense. She'd recorded 6 months of conversations, initially out of romantic sentiment, but increasingly out of growing suspicion. The recordings were damning. Mark's voice filled the courtroom, discussing the exit strategy after the house is liquidated with Eric. Eric confirming, "The old lady signed everything, she doesn't even know what she agreed to." And Mark laughing about the sister being too busy with her corporate job to notice what's happening right under her nose. Claire's voice shook as she continued. "I knew something was wrong 2 months before the wedding. I heard things that didn't make sense, saw documents that seemed off. But I was too scared to confront it and too angry at Victoria to ask her for help. So I blamed her instead. I convinced myself she was the problem, that she was jealous and vindictive. It was easier than admitting I'd been used." She turned in her seat to face me directly, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry, Victoria. For everything. For years of dismissing you, for telling you to disappear, for not seeing what you were trying to protect us from. I'm sorry." I nodded once, a small acknowledgement. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was something. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous on all counts. Guilty. Mark Chen and Eric Huang were convicted of wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. The judge scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later, but indicated the federal guidelines suggested 5 to 10 years in prison for each defendant, plus restitution orders, requiring them to repay all stolen funds and asset seizures to recover whatever they still possessed. Claire, because of her cooperation and the evidence she'd provided, received a plea bargain, 3 years probation, and 500 hours of mandated community service. She'd have a criminal record, but she wouldn't go to prison. As the court began to adjourn, the judge called me forward. "Ms. Whitmore, I have something for you." She handed me a sealed envelope, official court stamps across its closure. This was filed with the court 5 years ago by your father's attorney with instructions that it be delivered to you only after successful resolution of any estate disputes or legal challenges related to the protective trust clause. That condition has now been met. I took the envelope with hands that trembled despite my attempt at composure. The front bore my name in my father's handwriting, "To my daughter when justice finds you." I thanked the judge and walked out of the courtroom, Ruth beside me asking if I was all right. I nodded but couldn't speak. The envelope felt heavy-weighted with my father's final words with closure I hadn't known I needed. I made it to my car in the parking garage before the tears came. I sat behind the wheel staring at that envelope at my father's familiar handwriting, knowing that once I opened it, this chapter would truly be finished. The letter was his last gift, his final protection, and I wasn't sure I was ready to receive it yet. But ready or not, it was time to hear what he'd waited 5 years to tell me. I waited until I was home alone in my apartment with the door locked and the curtains drawn before opening the envelope. My hands were steadier than they'd been in the parking garage, but my heart was racing as I carefully broke the court seal and pulled out 2 sheets of paper covered in my father's handwriting. The script was shakier than in earlier documents, the letters formed with obvious effort, but it was unmistakably his. "Vicky," it began, and I could hear his voice as clearly as if he were sitting beside me. "If you're reading this, you've fought for what's right. You've stood up for yourself. You've let the law protect you the way I couldn't. I'm proud of you. But now comes the harder part. Don't let anger poison what you've won." He wrote about his own regrets, things I'd never heard him acknowledge when he was alive. How he'd stayed silent when he should have confronted my mother's favoritism. How he'd watched me shoulder responsibilities that should never have fallen to a teenager. How his illness had prevented him from fixing what he'd helped break. "I enabled your mother's weakness by not challenging it. I let you become invisible because it was easier than the conflict that honesty would have required. That's on me, not you." The next section made me set the letter down for a moment to collect myself. The house was supposed to be a home. It became a battlefield because we let old grief and unprocessed pain turn it toxic. Your mother never recovered from losing that baby between you and Claire. I never insisted she get help. We just let the wound fester until it infected everything. But you don't have to let it stay that way. Rebuild it. Not for them. For the next person who needs what you needed, safety recognition, a place where their worth isn't conditional. Attached to the letter was another legal document, this one titled Community Covenant. I read through the formal language, but the essence was clear. If I ever sold the house, a significant portion of the proceeds had to be placed in a trust fund designated specifically for supporting women who were restarting their lives after financial abuse, family estrangement, or similar crises. My father had built in accountability even for decisions I'd make years after his death. The letter concluded with a choice laid out plainly. You can sell the house, take the full proceeds minus the covenant amount, and walk away. You're legally entitled to do exactly that. Start fresh somewhere else with resources to build whatever life you want. Or you can transform the property itself into something that serves the covenant's purpose directly. I'm not asking you to sacrifice again. God knows you've sacrificed enough. I'm asking if you want to turn pain into purpose. Either choice is right. Either choice honors what we've both been through. But only one will let you sleep peacefully, and you'll know which one that is when you're ready to decide. I sat with that letter for hours, reading it multiple times, letting his words settle into places that had been hollow for so long. I thought about all the women like me, competent, responsible, slowly erased by families who needed them to be invisible. Women who'd signed documents they didn't understand because asking questions meant admitting vulnerability. Women who'd stayed silent because silence was survival. What did they need? Not revenge, not vindication. A place to rebuild where someone actually saw them. By dawn, I'd made my decision. But first, I needed distance. I needed to breathe air that didn't carry the weight of courtrooms and family history. I packed a single suitcase with practical clothes, my laptop, and the documents I'd need to start planning. I researched coastal rentals and found a small cottage in Cannon Beach available for monthly rental through the winter. My father had promised to take me there when I was young, one of many promises his illness had prevented him from keeping. I'd go there now, not to fulfill his broken promise, but to create my own. Before leaving, I composed an email to Thomas Chen, the community development specialist who'd approached Ruth after the failed auction. Mr. Chen, I'm ready to discuss the house. I want to transform it into a residential support program for women rebuilding after financial crisis or family estrangement. If your offer to help was genuine, I'd like to explore partnership options. I'll be away for a few weeks finalizing plans, but let's schedule a meeting when I return. Let's build something good from something broken. I hit send, then powered down my computer and loaded my car. The drive to the coast took 2 hours highway, giving way to winding roads through forest and finally emerging at the edge of the Pacific. The cottage was exactly as advertised, weathered blue paint, a small porch overlooking the beach windows that faced west toward endless water. I parked in the gravel driveway and sat for a long moment, engine off, listening to the distant sound of waves. For the first time in months, possibly years, I felt my shoulders drop from where they'd been tensed up near my ears. I exhaled slowly, deeply, letting out breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The cottage key was under the mat as promised. I unlocked the door and stepped inside to find simple furniture, clean surfaces, and the kind of profound quiet that comes from being far away from everything that's hurt you. I was ready to begin again. 6 months passed in Cannon Beach with a rhythm I hadn't known was possible. I renewed the cottage lease month by month, unwilling to commit to permanence, but equally unwilling to leave. My mornings began with walks on the beach at low tide, watching the Pacific pull back to reveal tide pools teeming with life that had been invisible just hours before. There was something profound in that daily transformation, the way hidden worlds became visible when the water receded. I felt like one of those tide pools finally exposed to air and light after years of being submerged. I started writing in the afternoons, not a memoir or anything meant for publication, just reflections on financial literacy and legal protections. I wrote about the questions I wished I'd asked earlier, about recognizing manipulation, about the difference between family loyalty and self-erasure. The writing was therapeutic, a way of organizing thoughts that had been tangled for decades. I had no plans to show it to anyone. It was enough that the words existed outside my head. In March, the director of the local community center called. Someone had mentioned I'd worked in compliance and had experience with estate law. Would I be willing to teach a workshop on understanding estate documents for seniors? She said many older residents felt overwhelmed by legal paperwork and were afraid to ask questions that might make them seem uninformed. I agreed, expecting maybe 3 or 4 attendees. 8 women showed up that first Saturday morning, all over 55, carrying folders stuffed with papers they'd been told to sign or had already signed without fully understanding. For 2 hours, I walked them through the basics: what a will actually does, how trusts work, why powers of attorney matter, what questions to ask before signing anything. I used plain language, avoided legal jargon, and treated every question as legitimate, no matter how basic. Near the end, a woman named Margaret, probably in her late 60s, started crying. "I'm sorry," she said, wiping her eyes. "It's just that no one's ever treated me like I was smart enough to understand this. My son's lawyer talks over my head. My financial advisor uses words I don't know and gets impatient when I ask what they mean. You just explained more in 2 hours than I've understood in 10 years. The workshop led to another request, then another. Women brought friends. I created a simple 1-page handout titled 5 Questions to Ask Before Signing Anything, with space for notes. It was basic, almost embarrassingly simple, but that was the point. People started photocopying it and sharing it at church groups, senior centers, library bulletin boards. I wasn't advertising or charging fees. I was just offering the knowledge my father had given me, the education that had helped me recognize when something was wrong. A local journalist named Lisa attended one of the workshops and afterward asked if she could write a short feature. The article that appeared in the Cannon Beach Gazette was kind and measured. Former Portland woman helps seniors navigate legal confusion. It focused on empowerment and education rather than scandal. The piece mentioned my background without dwelling on the trial, framing my workshops as community service, rather than revenge or rehabilitation. Slowly, my identity in this small town shifted from that woman with the family drama to the compliance officer who teaches free workshops. Letters started arriving forwarded through Ruth's office from women who'd been victims in the Mark and Eric case. Some I recognized from the trial. Others I'd never met, but who'd lost savings or homes to the same scheme that had targeted my family. They thanked me for not staying quiet, for pushing until the system responded. One letter from a woman in Eugene described losing her late husband's life insurance payout to a refinancing scam Eric had orchestrated. "I thought I was stupid for not understanding the paperwork," she wrote. "Now I know I was targeted because they thought I'd be too ashamed to ask questions. You gave us hope that justice is possible." I pinned these letters on the cottage wall, creating a collage of stories that reminded me why speaking up had mattered. The pain I'd experienced hadn't been meaningless. It had led to exposure, prosecution, prevention. Not revenge, restoration. For myself and for women I'd never met, but whose struggles I recognized intimately. I was sitting on the porch one evening in late April, watching the sun set over the Pacific, when I heard the mail slot rattle. I retrieved a single envelope, handwritten address postmarked from Coffee Creek Correctional Facility. The return address listed an inmate number and a name, Claire Whitmore. I stood holding the envelope for a long moment, watching the last light fade from the sky before carrying it inside to read by lamplight. The letter was 8 pages long, front and back, filled with Claire's handwriting that had always been rounder and more decorative than mine. But there was nothing decorative about the words themselves. They were raw, unfiltered, the kind of honesty that only comes when you have nothing left to lose and everything left to face. "I was jealous of you my whole life." The letter began no preamble or small talk. "You were smart, independent, capable of things I couldn't imagine doing. You didn't need anyone's approval to know your worth. I built my entire identity around being the favorite, the pretty one, the one people liked. When Mark paid attention to me, when he chose me, I felt powerful for the first time. Like I'd finally won something you couldn't have." She wrote about the warning signs she'd deliberately ignored. Mark's vague answers about his business, Eric's too comfortable familiarity with our family's finances, the way Mark would disappear for days without real explanation. "I saw all of it," she admitted, "but I told myself you were just jealous that you couldn't stand to see me happy. It was easier to make you the villain than to admit I was being used." The hardest part to read was her description of the moment she'd finally understood. When the wedding collapsed and Mark disappeared, I kept thinking he'd come back, that there was some explanation. Even when you showed me the evidence, part of me wanted to believe you'd fabricated it somehow. But then I listened to those recordings I'd made, really listened, and I heard what you'd been trying to tell me all along. I'd been so desperate to be chosen that I'd let myself become a tool. You were right about everything, and I hated you for it. Now I just hate what I became. Tucked into the envelope were photocopied pages from a journal Claire had been keeping since her arrest. I read through entries dated over the past 6 months, watching her thought process evolve on paper. The early entries were full of anger at me, blaming me for ruining her life, convinced that if I'd just stayed out of it, everything would have worked out. Then the anger shifted to Mark, pages of hurt and betrayal as reality set in. But gradually, the focus turned inward. One entry dated 3 months into her incarceration struck me particularly hard. "We had group therapy today. A woman named Teresa talked about how her boyfriend convinced her to steal from her employer. She kept saying, 'I don't know how I let it happen,' and the counselor said, 'You let it happen because making your own decisions felt harder than letting someone else decide for you.' I realized that's exactly what I did. I was a puppet, but I let someone else hold the strings because it was easier than deciding who I wanted to be." Another entry, more recent, read, "Victoria never yelled at me, never gloated, never said I told you so, even though she had every right to. She just enforced boundaries and let me face consequences. Her silence taught me more than anyone's shouting ever did. She showed me what actual strength looks like, and it's nothing like what I thought it was. Claire's letter included a statement I hadn't expected. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve that. I told you to disappear, and you did, and when you came back, it was with the truth I'd been too cowardly to face. You saved me from making an even bigger mistake, and I repaid you with years of cruelty. I can't fix that. I can only try to become someone different. The letter ended with a question that felt both vulnerable and manipulative, in a way I suspected Claire didn't even recognize. When I finish my sentence in 8 months, I don't know where I'll go or who I'll be. Mom is moving to Arizona to live with her sister. She can't face Portland anymore, can't face the neighbors who know what happened. I don't blame her. But I need to start over without running away from what I did. If there's any chance you'd let me prove I've changed if you're building something with that house like I heard you might be, will you tell me I want to help if you'll let me? I want to do something that matters instead of just existing to be admired. I read the letter 3 times that evening, then sat on the porch watching the tide come in. Part of me recognized genuine growth in Claire's words. The self-awareness seemed real, earned through months of forced reflection and therapy. But another part remembered decades of being dismissed of Claire's casual cruelty of being told to disappear. Could people really change that fundamentally? Or was this just another performance, another way of getting what she needed from me? I thought about my father's letter about turning pain into purpose. I thought about the women in my workshops who'd made mistakes and were trying to learn from them. I thought about Amanda, who'd been manipulated by Mark and was now helping other victims. Everyone deserved a chance at redemption if they were willing to do the actual work. The question was whether Claire was willing, or whether this was just another version of needing me to solve her problems. I pulled out paper and a pen and began writing a response. The words came slowly, carefully, each one chosen with precision, because I knew this letter would set the terms for whatever relationship we might have going forward. When I finished, I read it over twice, sealed it in an envelope, and walked to the post office before I could second-guess myself. What I wrote, Claire would discover in a few days. But the answer wasn't forgiveness or reconciliation. It was something more conditional, more honest, and considerably more difficult than either of us had managed before. It was a chance with boundaries, and that was all I could offer. 9 months after the trial, I drove back to Portland. The house had been sitting empty since my mother moved to Arizona, maintained by the estate management company, but essentially frozen in time. I'd avoided returning for months, letting Cannon Beach heal wounds I hadn't known were still bleeding. But Thomas Chen had emailed twice asking when we could tour the property, and I couldn't put off the decision forever. I parked in the driveway and sat for a moment staring at the place where I'd grown up. It looked smaller than I remembered, more ordinary. Just a house with weathered siding and a porch that needed repair. I let myself in with the key I'd never returned and stepped into silence that felt almost physical. Walking through those rooms was like touring a museum of my own life. The kitchen where I'd cooked thousands of meals no one had thanked me for, where I'd learned to manage a household budget at 16, where Claire had told me the best gift I could give was to disappear. The living room where my mother had barely glanced at the framed photo I'd brought to the pre-wedding dinner, where family gatherings had always felt like performances I was watching, rather than participating in. But the house held other memories too. I climbed the stairs to what had been my father's workshop, the room now empty except for sawdust ghosts and the faint smell of wood. He'd taught me here how to measure twice and cut once, how to sand with the grain, how patience produced better results than speed. I remembered his hands guiding mine on a plane, showing me how to read wood's natural patterns. The window seat in the upstairs hallway where I'd read books as a girl, escaping into stories where quiet competence was valued rather than dismissed. The house wasn't evil. It was just a structure that had absorbed the pain of the people who'd lived in it. What mattered now was what I chose to do with that structure going forward. Thomas Chen arrived precisely on time, parking a sensible sedan and approaching with a leather portfolio under his arm. He was in his early 70s but moved with the energy of someone who still had projects to complete. We shook hands on the porch, and I invited him inside. "Your father saved my business 25 years ago," Thomas said as we stood in the empty living room. "I was 3 months from bankruptcy. Every bank had turned me down. Your father barely knew me, but he co-signed a loan based on nothing but a business plan and a handshake. No one else believed in me." He walked to the window looking out at the overgrown garden. "I'm a developer now. Community housing, senior co-ops, transitional programs. I've spent my career building places where people can restart their lives with dignity. If you want to turn this house into something good, I have resources and experience. Not charity, partnership. We'd restore the structure, create private suites, add a community space for counseling and job training, provide legal aid resources. A residential support program for women rebuilding after financial abuse, legal trouble, family fractures. Women who need time and space to figure out who they are when they're not defined by someone else's needs." I walked through the house with Thomas seeing it through his eyes. The 4 bedrooms upstairs could become private suites with individual bathrooms. The living room and dining room could merge into a community gathering space. The kitchen would need updating, but the bones were solid. My father's workshop in the garage could be transformed into a vocational training center teaching skills that led to employment rather than just hobbies. "The structure is good," Thomas said, running his hand along a doorframe. "Your father built quality into this place. It deserves a second life." I stood in the center of what had been the living room, feeling the weight of decisions settle around me. "This was supposed to be a home," I said quietly. "It became something else. Something that hurt people. But that doesn't mean it has to stay that way." Thomas waited, giving me space to think. "Let's make it a home again," I continued. "For women who need what I needed. A place where their worth isn't conditional. Where someone sees them. Where they can rebuild without judgment." Thomas smiled, and it reached his eyes. "Then let's build." We spent the next 2 hours touring every room, Thomas making notes and sketches, asking about capacity and programming, discussing timelines and budgets. By late afternoon, we'd outlined a plan that felt both ambitious and achievable. He pulled a partnership agreement from his portfolio, one his attorney had drafted, based on our earlier email exchanges. I read through it carefully, my compliance training making me examine every clause, every commitment, every potential vulnerability. It was fair, more than fair. Thomas was offering expertise and capital in exchange for shared governance, and the satisfaction of honoring a debt to my father. The covenant my father had written into his final letter would be preserved, ensuring the program would continue, even if I eventually stepped away. I signed the agreement on my father's old desk, which the estate company had left in what had been his study. Thomas signed as witness. We shook hands again, and this time it felt like sealing a promise to someone who couldn't be there to see it fulfilled, but had made it possible anyway. 3 months later, after permits and renovations and countless decisions about paint colors and furniture, a sign went up in the front yard. "Victoria's Promise, a home for new beginnings." The house that had tried to erase me was now marked permanently, with my name transformed into something that would help other women refuse their own erasure. My father would have been proud. Victoria's Promise officially opened its doors 18 months after the trial on a clear Saturday morning in late spring. The house had been transformed so completely that neighbors who'd watched the renovation barely recognized it. Fresh paint covered the exterior in soft sage green. The porch had been rebuilt and widened. Inside, the 4 upstairs bedrooms had become private suites, each with its own bathroom and small sitting area. The main floor now housed a communal kitchen, a living room arranged for group meetings, and an office where residents could meet privately with counselors or attorneys. The program was designed specifically for women over 50 facing financial recovery, post-incarceration reentry, or family estrangement. Residents could stay up to 12 months while receiving comprehensive support, legal aid to understand their rights and options, financial counseling to rebuild credit and manage money, job placement assistance, tailored to women re-entering the workforce after long absences and therapy to process trauma and build healthier relationship patterns. We could accommodate 6 women at a time, a number small enough to maintain individual attention, but large enough to create community. I'd hired a professional director, a woman named Dr. Patricia Moore, who'd spent 20 years running transitional housing programs and understood both the practical and emotional complexities involved. Our staff included a full-time social worker, a part-time employment counselor, and Ruth, who volunteered 8 hours a week providing legal consultation. We also trained peer mentors, women who'd graduated from similar programs and wanted to give back. Everything about Victoria's Promise was designed around dignity and accessibility. We used plain language in all our materials, assumed no prior knowledge, and never made residents feel inadequate for asking questions. The local newspaper covered our opening with a thoughtful piece that brought unexpected support. Furniture donations arrived from neighbors who'd once gossiped about my family drama, but now saw something worth supporting. Local businesses offered job opportunities. Volunteers signed up to teach resume writing, computer skills, and financial basics. The house that had symbolized my erasure, now offered visibility to women's society, had taught to disappear. I didn't run day-to-day operations. That was Patricia's domain, and she was far better at it than I would have been. Instead, I served on the board, attended monthly meetings, and taught a financial literacy workshop once a month that had become surprisingly popular. I also made myself available to meet with any resident who wanted to hear my story, though I never presented myself as a hero or inspiration, just someone who'd learned to enforce boundaries and use legal resources wisely. One afternoon, a resident named Dorothy asked to speak with me privately. She was 58, her retirement savings stolen by a son with a gambling addiction she'd enabled for years. I thought I was stupid. She told me, hands wrapped around a mug of tea. I kept thinking if I'd just been smarter, I would have seen what he was doing. But you made me understand I wasn't stupid for trusting the wrong person. That's not stupidity. That's just being human. And recognizing that is the first step to trusting myself again. Sitting across from Dorothy, I realized something profound. Helping these women reclaim their agency was healing me too. Every workshop I taught, every story I heard, every small victory celebrated, added another layer of meaning to pain that had once felt meaningless. By the end of our first year, 3 other Oregon towns had contacted us about replicating the model. I shared everything freely: our budget templates, our curriculum materials, our legal frameworks, even our mistakes and what we'd learned from them. I didn't franchise or seek profit. When a journalist from a statewide magazine asked why I was giving away what could be a lucrative business model, I told her simply, "It's not a business. It's what happens when you stop letting pain define you and start letting it direct you towards something bigger than yourself." The story spread through senior networks, church groups, women's organizations. I did a handful of interviews, always focusing on the program rather than my personal story, always emphasizing that this was about creating systems that protected vulnerable people, rather than about individual revenge or redemption. I became quietly known in certain circles, not famous but respected, and that was exactly what I wanted. Recognition without performance. Impact without ego. I was in my apartment one evening reviewing applications from potential residents when an official envelope arrived from the Oregon Department of Corrections. I opened it carefully, already guessing what it contained. Parole hearing notice. Claire Whitmore has requested Victoria Whitmore serve as a character witness at her upcoming parole review. Your presence is requested but not required. Please respond within 10 business days. I set the letter down and looked out my window at the Portland skyline. Claire had served 8 months. Her request meant she believed my testimony could help secure her release, that I had the power to influence whether she walked free or stayed incarcerated longer. The question was whether she deserved that help and whether I was ready to give it. I responded to the notice within a week, agreeing to attend the parole hearing. Claire had served 14 months of a 3-year sentence, and with good behavior and her cooperation during the trial, she was eligible for supervised release. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at the correctional facility, a low-security campus-style facility an hour outside Portland. The hearing room was smaller than I'd expected, more like a conference room than a courtroom. Claire sat at a table with her attorney, a public defender who looked competent but overworked. The parole board consisted of 3 members, 2 women and 1 man, all middle-aged, all reviewing thick files as people filed in. I sat in the observer section along with a victim advocate representing some of the families Mark and Eric had defrauded. When Claire was called forward, I almost didn't recognize her. She'd lost weight, but it was more than that. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail with no styling. She wore no makeup. Her posture had changed too, less performative, more grounded. She looked like someone who'd stopped performing and started existing. The board chair asked her to make a statement. Claire stood holding a single sheet of paper that trembled slightly in her hands. "I take full responsibility for my actions." She began, her voice steady despite the shaking paper. "I enabled fraud by choosing ignorance over investigation. I ignored warning signs because facing them would have meant admitting I'd been used. I hurt my sister, my family, and the other victims of Mark Chen and Eric Huang's scheme. I specifically want to apologize to the Morrison family, the Chen family, the Rodriguez family, and the others whose names I learned during the trial. My willful blindness contributed to their losses." She set down the prepared statement and spoke more freely. "In the past 14 months, I've completed 3 financial literacy courses and earned certificates in basic accounting and legal document comprehension. I've participated in group therapy twice a week, working to understand how I let vanity and fear make me vulnerable to manipulation. My counselors have provided letters documenting this work, which are in your file." The board asked about her post-release plans. Claire took a breath. "I've applied to volunteer at Victoria's Promise, a transitional housing program my sister founded. I don't know if she'll accept me, but I want to spend my community service hours helping women avoid the mistakes I made. Teaching them to ask questions I was too proud to ask. Showing them that ignorance isn't bliss, it's dangerous." Then it was my turn. The board chair called me forward and asked if I had testimony to offer regarding Claire's character and rehabilitation potential. I stood aware that my words carried weight I'd never possessed in our family dynamic before. Claire made terrible choices. I began, keeping my voice calm and measured. She hurt people, including me. She enabled criminals by refusing to see what was obvious. But she's also taken real accountability, and I don't mean just words. She provided evidence that helped convict Mark and Eric. She didn't have to do that. She could have protected herself and stayed silent. Instead, she chose to help build the case against them. I paused, making sure the board was listening. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. It isn't pretending the harm didn't happen. It's choosing to let someone prove they've changed through actions, not promises. Claire has asked to volunteer at Victoria's Promise. I'm willing to let her try under supervision and with clear boundaries, not because I owe her anything, and not because family should automatically forgive family, but because transformation should be possible for people who do the actual work of becoming different. The board deliberated for 20 minutes before announcing their decision. Claire was granted parole with strict conditions, 500 hours of community service at an approved organization. Victoria's Promise being pre-approved pending my final consent. Continued counseling sessions twice monthly for the first year. Employment within 90 days of release. Residence in an approved halfway house for the first 6 months before transitioning to independent living, and regular check-ins with a parole officer. As the hearing concluded and people began filing out, Claire approached me in the hallway. Her eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying dramatically. "Thank you," she whispered. I looked at her for a long moment. This woman who'd told me to disappear, who'd been complicit in nearly destroying everything our father had tried to protect. "Don't thank me," I said quietly. "Prove it. Prove you've actually changed. Prove this isn't just another performance to get what you need." She nodded, understanding that this wasn't reconciliation or forgiveness. It was a chance an opportunity to demonstrate through consistent action over time that she'd become someone different from the person who'd enabled fraud and cruelty. "I will," she said. "I promise I will." 3 months later, on a cool October morning exactly 2 years after the wedding that never happened, Claire arrived at Victoria's Promise for her first day of community service. I watched from the office window as she got out of a modest used car dressed in jeans and a simple shirt, carrying a notebook and looking nervous in a way that seemed genuine rather than calculated. Patricia met her at the door. I'd briefed the entire staff about Claire's history and made it clear that she would be treated like any other volunteer expected to be on time to follow protocols to earn trust through consistency rather than receive it automatically. I didn't greet Claire at the door. That would have been performative, a gesture toward reconciliation neither of us had earned yet. Instead, I let her begin the work of proving she'd changed one shift at a time, one interaction at a time, building credibility through actions rather than words. It was all anyone could ask. And it was exactly what she needed to do. The media request came in November, about a month after Claire started volunteering. A producer from Oregon Public Broadcasting reached out through Victoria's Promise asking if I'd be willing to participate in a series called Community Healing After Financial Crimes. They wanted to interview people who'd been affected by fraud schemes and talk about recovery, systemic protections, and rebuilding trust. My first instinct was to decline. I'd never been comfortable with public attention, and the idea of having my story broadcast to thousands of listeners felt exposing in ways I wasn't sure I could handle. But Ruth, when I called her for advice, had a different perspective. "Your story could help thousands of women recognize warning signs before they become victims," she said. "It could help them understand their legal rights, learn to set boundaries, see that speaking up is possible. You don't have to be a victim or a villain in the telling. You can just tell the truth on your terms, in your own words." I thought about the women in my workshops who'd thanked me for explaining things in language they could understand. I thought about the letters from victims who'd said my willingness to pursue justice had given them hope. Maybe Ruth was right. Maybe sharing my story more widely could be a tool for education rather than just exposure. I agreed to the interview with conditions it would be recorded, not live, so I could choose my words carefully. I'd have the opportunity to review the final cut before it aired, and the focus had to be on systemic issues and practical guidance rather than sensationalized family drama. The interviewer, a woman named Sarah Chen, met me at Victoria's Promise on a quiet afternoon. She was professional and respectful, her questions thoughtful rather than exploitative. We talked for over an hour about recognizing financial manipulation, the importance of documentation, understanding estate documents, and how to enforce boundaries without guilt. I explained how silence could be strategic rather than weak, how choosing not to engage with someone's chaos was different from being a doormat, how legal systems could protect you if you understood how to use them properly. "What would you say to women who feel trapped by family obligation?" Sarah asked near the end. I thought carefully before answering. Family obligation is real and honoring it matters. But obligation doesn't mean accepting abuse or enabling harm. You can love someone and still refuse to be destroyed by them. That's not cruelty. That's survival. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for people is let them face the consequences of their choices instead of constantly rescuing them from reality. The interview aired 3 weeks later as part of a 4-episode series. I listened to it alone in my apartment, hearing my own voice coming through the speakers, strange and familiar at once. Sarah had edited it beautifully, keeping the focus on education and empowerment rather than personal drama. She'd woven in expert commentary from attorneys and financial counselors, making my story one example within a larger conversation about elder financial abuse and family manipulation. The response was overwhelming. Within days, letters started arriving at Victoria's Promise forwarded from OPB, women thanking me for language that helped them articulate experiences they'd struggled to explain. One letter from a woman in Eugene read, "You didn't make me feel stupid for not understanding legal documents. You made me feel empowered to ask questions." That shift in perspective changed everything for me. Another from a woman in Bend. I thought setting boundaries with my adult children meant being cruel and selfish. You showed me it just means being clear about what I will and won't accept. I'm 63 years old, and I'm just now learning I'm allowed to say no. The program received a surge of donations enough to fund a part-time counselor position we'd been trying to budget for. Volunteer applications tripled. Speaking invitations came from senior centers, church groups, and women's organizations across the state. I declined most of them, not wanting the work to become about me or to let my identity be consumed by this story. But I accepted a few local opportunities where I could provide practical education rather than just share my narrative. I realized something important through this process. My story, told on my terms with intention and boundaries, could be a tool that helped others without requiring me to perform or relive trauma repeatedly. I could control how much I shared and with whom, maintaining privacy while still offering something useful to women who needed it. Claire had been volunteering at Victoria's Promise for 3 months by this point, working primarily in the administrative office. Patricia had assigned her tasks that involved helping residents understand court documents, navigate legal paperwork, and organize their financial records. I'd been watching from a distance, not interfering but not ignoring, either trying to assess whether her transformation was genuine or just another performance. One evening I was working late in my office when I heard voices in the common area. Through the partially open door I could see Claire sitting at the dining table with Marjorie, one of our residents who was 71 and rebuilding after her nephew had stolen her identity and ruined her credit. Marjorie was clearly embarrassed, her face flushed, as she tried to explain that she didn't understand the form the court had sent her. "I feel so stupid," Marjorie was saying. "Everyone acts like this should be obvious." Claire's response made me pause. "You're not stupid," she said gently, and there was no condescension in her voice, no performance of patience. "These forms are designed to be confusing. They use language that makes people feel inadequate so they won't ask questions. That's intentional. It keeps power in the hands of people who understand the system and makes everyone else feel like they don't deserve help." She pulled the form closer and started walking Marjorie through it, section by section, explaining each term in plain language, asking questions to make sure Marjorie understood rather than just nodding along. "This word here, petitioner, that just means the person who's asking the court for something. In this case, that's you. And respondent is the person you're asking about, which is your nephew. See how once you know what the words mean, it's not actually complicated, they just made it sound complicated." I watched for another 10 minutes as Claire patiently worked through the entire document with Marjorie, never once making her feel inadequate or stupid, treating her confusion as reasonable rather than shameful. When they finished, Marjorie was smiling, the form completed correctly, her confidence visibly restored. "Thank you," Marjorie said. "You made me feel like I could actually handle this." "You can handle it," Claire replied. "You just needed someone to explain it in actual human language instead of legal jargon designed to intimidate people." After Marjorie left, I stayed in my office thinking about what I'd witnessed. It wasn't forgiveness exactly what I felt. Forgiveness seemed too big, too final, too much like saying the past didn't matter. But it was acknowledgement. Claire was doing the work. She was showing up consistently, treating residents with genuine respect, using her own experience with manipulation and fraud to help others avoid similar mistakes. It was slow and unglamorous, and often tedious. But it was real. The transformation might actually be genuine. Time would tell, but the early evidence was promising. I was preparing to leave for the evening, gathering my things and turning off lights, when I heard a tentative knock at the front door. We didn't typically have visitors after 6, and all the residents had keys. I walked to the entrance and looked through the window. My mother stood on the porch clutching the leather-bound photo album that had been restored years ago, the one that documented my relationship with my father. She looked older than when I'd last seen her in Arizona. More fragile, her hair completely white now. She was alone. I opened the door slowly, not sure what to expect. "Victoria," she said, her voice uncertain. "I know I don't have the right to just show up, but I need to give you this, and I need to tell you something. Please." I looked at her at the album she held like an offering at the vulnerability in her face that I'd never seen before. Behind me, I could hear the soft sounds of the house coming alive for evening residents preparing dinner. Someone laughing in the common room. The ordinary sounds of women rebuilding their lives in a space that used to be a battlefield. I stepped aside and let my mother in. I led my mother to the small sitting room just off the main entrance, a quiet space we used for private conversations. She sat carefully moving with the deliberate precision of someone whose body no longer responded reliably. That's when I noticed the slight tremor in her hands, the way she braced herself against the chair arm. "I was diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's 4 months ago," she said before I could ask. "My sister in Arizona tried to help, but she has her own health issues. I moved back to Oregon last week. I'm staying in a hotel temporarily while I figure out what comes next." She set the photo album on the coffee table between us, her trembling hands smoothing the leather cover. "I'm not here to ask for money or a place to stay. I'm here to give you this. I found it in storage in Arizona. I'd hidden it years ago because looking at it made me feel guilty. But you should have it. These are yours." I opened the album slowly. Inside were photographs I'd thought were lost forever. My college graduation where I stood alone in my cap and gown because my mother hadn't attended. A photo from the ceremony where I'd received a Regional Compliance Excellence Award 3 years ago, taken by a colleague because no family had come. Pictures of me at various ages doing ordinary things, reading on the porch, helping my father in his workshop, studying at the kitchen table. Moments of my life my mother had documented but then hidden because they didn't fit the narrative she preferred. "I destroyed some photos," she admitted quietly. "The ones of you and your father looking happy together. I was jealous of that relationship. But these I just hid. I couldn't quite bring myself to erase you completely even when I was trying to pretend you didn't matter." She looked up at me, her eyes wet. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. But I'm asking if you'll let me witness what you've built here. I need to see that something good came from my failures. That you managed to become someone extraordinary despite having me as a mother." It wasn't self-pity in her voice. It was accountability, perhaps the first genuine accountability she'd ever offered me. "Come with me," I said, standing. I led her through the house, showing her the resident suites upstairs, the communal spaces where women gathered for meals and support groups, the office where Claire worked, helping residents understand documents that had once confused and intimidated them. We ended in the garden behind the house, a space our volunteers had planted with native Oregon flowers that bloomed in rotating succession from spring through fall. We sat on a wooden bench Patricia's husband had built, surrounded by late autumn blooms, still clinging to life before winter. I asked the question I'd never had the courage to ask before. Why was it so hard to love me? My mother was quiet for a long time, watching a bee work its way through the last flowers of the season. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with tears. "Because you didn't need me. From the time you were 16, you were competent and independent. You survived despite me, not because of me. Claire needed me constantly. She needed reassurance and help and guidance. That made me feel useful, necessary. I mistook her dependence for love and your independence for rejection." She turned to look at me directly. By the time I realized I'd confused neediness with closeness, by the time I understood that strength and competence were their own kind of need that I'd ignored, I didn't know how to fix it. Fixing it would have meant admitting how badly I'd failed you for so many years. So I just kept failing you because that was easier than facing what I'd done. It wasn't an excuse. It was just honest, finally. And hearing it, I felt something in my chest that had been clenched tight for decades begin to loosen, not disappear. The anger and hurt didn't vanish, but they loosened enough that I could breathe around them. We sat in silence for a while, watching the afternoon light change. Then I told her what I'd arranged. I'd contacted a senior living community 20 minutes away, a place that specialized in early-stage Parkinson's care. They had an available unit, 1 bedroom, with medical support on site. I'd pay the first 6 months, giving her time to get her Social Security and Medicare sorted out. After that, she'd be responsible for her own expenses. "I'm not saving you from consequences," I said clearly. "I'm making sure you have what you need to live with them safely. There's a difference." My mother nodded, understanding the distinction. "Thank you. That's more than I deserve." As we walked back to the front entrance, she stopped and turned to me. She held out her arms hesitantly, asking without words if she could hug me. I allowed it, stepping into an embrace that was awkward and brief, our bodies unfamiliar with this kind of contact. But it was honest, the first honest physical affection we'd shared in decades. As we pulled apart, she whispered something so quietly, I almost didn't hear it. "You were always the best thing I did. I just couldn't say it until I lost everything else." I watched her walk to her car, moving carefully, one hand steadying herself against the railing. She didn't look back. Neither did I cry, nor feel triumphant. I just felt settled in a way I hadn't before, as if a question that had haunted me my entire life had finally received an answer. Not the answer I'd wanted, just the truth, which turned out to be enough. 2 years after Victoria's Promise opened its doors, I stood in the common room during an evening when the house felt most alive. The walls were covered with photographs, now a rotating gallery of current and former residents. Women rebuilding their lives, smiling at cameras, strong in ways they hadn't known they could be. In a glass display case near the entrance sat my father's restored photo album, open to a page showing him teaching me to use a hand plane in his workshop. Beside it, the USB drive containing his final video message rested on a small stand with a placard explaining its significance. These weren't kept private or hidden. They were educational tools. Every new resident heard the story during orientation, a father who'd protected his daughter through legal foresight, a daughter who'd chosen justice over bitterness, a family that had fractured and was slowly, imperfectly healing. The lesson we emphasized wasn't that revenge felt satisfying. It was that boundaries were necessary for survival, and that pain could have purpose if you were willing to transform it into something larger than yourself. A brass plaque mounted near the display case read simply, "This home exists because someone chose to turn erasure into permanence." The house that had once echoed with my invisibility now hummed with women's voices at all hours. In the converted workshop, Dorothy sat with our technology volunteer, learning to use spreadsheet software so she could apply for bookkeeping positions. In the living room, a 58-year-old woman named Janet practiced job interview responses with a career counselor, her confidence growing with each rehearsed answer. At the dining table, Claire sat with a new resident named Beth, patiently explaining how to read a credit report, pointing out which items could be disputed and which required different strategies. My mother visited once a month now, always on Sunday afternoons. She'd sit in the garden wrapped in a cardigan, even on warm days, just watching. She never intruded or tried to insert herself into the work. She simply bore witness to what had grown from the ruins of our family, and perhaps that witnessing was its own form of penance. Thomas Chen stopped by regularly, checking on structural issues and offering advice on expansion possibilities. During one visit, standing in the kitchen watching residents prepare a communal dinner, he'd said quietly, "Your father would be proud of this." I'd nodded, feeling the truth of it. I think he already knew this is what I'd do. That's why he built the protections. He knew I'd need the legal framework, but he trusted I'd figure out the purpose on my own. Now, as evening settled into dusk, I stood on the front porch, watching residents gather for dinner. The dining room glowed with warm light. Laughter carried through open windows. Someone had brought flowers for the table. These small rituals of normalcy and community had become the heartbeat of this place. I thought about the wedding invitation that had started everything about the video that had erased me from family history as if I'd never existed. I'd been told to disappear casually and cruelly by people who'd benefited from my labor and sacrifice for decades. Instead of disappearing, I'd become impossible to forget. Not through spectacle or drama or public revenge, but through substance. Through building something that would outlast all of us, that would help women long after I was gone. My legacy wasn't revenge. It was this house that protected people when their families failed them. It was a voice that spoke truth when others demanded silence. It was a promise kept not to those who'd hurt me, but to those who would come after, who would need what I'd needed: recognition, safety, and the knowledge that their worth wasn't conditional on someone else's approval. That was the softest victory and the most enduring. Not destruction, but creation. Not erasure, but permanence. As I turned to go inside, a car pulled up to the curb. A woman in her mid-60s got out slowly, looking at the house with an expression I recognized. Hope mixed with shame. Determination, fighting with fear. She walked up the path and stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, clutching her purse with both hands. "Are you Victoria?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I am." She took a breath, steadying herself. "I pushed my daughter away years ago. I saw your interview on OPB. I heard you talk about boundaries and accountability and—" She paused, struggling with the words. "Can you teach me how to bring her back?" I looked at this woman, this stranger carrying wounds similar to my mother's, seeking something I wasn't sure I could give, but knowing I had to try. Because that was the point of all of this. The house, the program, the story I'd finally allowed myself to tell. It wasn't about my family's specific dysfunction. It was about the universal truth that people could change if they were willing to do the work, that bridges could be rebuilt if both sides showed up honestly, and that sometimes the person who'd been hurt most badly was the one who ended up teaching others how to heal. I stepped aside and opened the door. "Come in," I said. "Let's talk." So that's my story. The wedding invitation that erased me became the catalyst that transformed everything. My family told me to disappear, and I did, but not in the way they expected. I disappeared from their narrative of convenience and reappeared in a story of my own making, one where boundaries weren't cruelty and silence wasn't weakness. Victoria's Promise is thriving now, 3 years after it opened. We've helped 42 women rebuild their lives. Some have moved on to independent housing and stable employment. Others are still here doing the work of becoming who they were before someone convinced them they were worthless. Claire still volunteers 3 days a week, and while our relationship will never be what it might have been, it's honest now, which is something. My mother visits when her health allows, sitting in that garden, bearing witness to the good that grew from her failures. The house that was supposed to be my inheritance became something better than I could have imagined. Not just mine, but ours. A place where women learn that their worth isn't measured by how well they serve others or how quietly they absorb cruelty. Where legal documents are explained in plain language. Where asking questions is encouraged rather than punished. Where disappearing is never the answer. My father knew what he was doing when he built those legal protections. He saw the patterns I was too close to recognize. He understood that sometimes love means giving someone the tools to save themselves rather than trying to save them directly. His legacy isn't the house or the money or even the protective trust clause. It's the lesson that planning for justice is an act of love, that documentation matters, and that the strongest protection you can offer someone is the legal framework to enforce their own boundaries. If my story resonates with you, if you've ever felt erased by the people who should have seen you, if you've ever been told your competence made you less lovable or your boundaries made you cruel, I want you to know something: you're not alone. Your pain has purpose if you choose to give it one. Your silence can be strategy. Your disappearance can be transformation. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and self-protection? Have you experienced being erased from your own story? What would you do if you discovered legal protections you didn't know existed? Share your experiences in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And if this story helped you in any way, if it gave you language for something you've been struggling to articulate or permission to enforce boundaries you've been afraid to set, please subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next story. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is let someone know they're not crazy for feeling invisible, and that becoming visible again is possible. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for being here. And remember, when someone tells you to disappear, you get to choose what that means. You can vanish into their version of events, or you can disappear from their control and reappear as someone they can never erase again. The choice has always been yours.